Got everybody here?
Councillor Hills looks like he stepped out.
It is 6 o'clock and we are opening this work session for the Carlton City Council for the month of February. Could you take the roll call, please?
Right. Councillor David Samuel Hill.
Here.
Councillor Carolyn Thompson Reiser.
Here.
Councillor Grant Erickson.
Here.
Councillor Jeremy Brandel.
Here.
Councillor Shirley Ward Mullen.
Here.
Council President Kevin Skipper.
Here.
Mayor Linda Watkins.
Here.
All councillors are present and accounted.
Where do we go from here?
There are no changes to the agenda tonight, Mayor. And for our work session, we have a draft code review, the final 3 sections. And Steve Faust and Elizabeth Decker are here with us tonight to facilitate that for us.
Thank you. Hi, Steve and Elizabeth.
Good evening.
Why don't you
everyone.
just,
Go ahead.
pardon?
I just said good evening.
Good evening. How are you guys doing tonight?
Wonderful.
Good,
Thank you.
thanks. I fixed my conference room lights, so they're not going to go out in the middle of this meeting. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion without interruptions.
Congratulations. You're a step ahead of me. We'll just turn this over to you and let you two take it from here.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Mayor Watkins and councilors, thank you for having us here again this evening. It's good to be back with you. I apologize. I had a conflict last month, but I understand that the work session went well. We'll stick to the same basic procedure this evening. I'll do my best to call on everyone and keep us on time while Elizabeth does the bulk of the presentation. I'll note that Elizabeth will be using not a PowerPoint presentation this evening, but the memo that you all received based on what we understand was your request. And towards the end of the meeting, we'll cover a few topics or review a few topics briefly, just kind of list them out that you will have some time to talk about at your March work session before we begin the adoption process for the code. So with that, and Elizabeth will probably talk a little bit more about those things, but that's just a quick preview, and I'll hand it over to Elizabeth.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you, Mayor, council members, and staff for having us here tonight. We're here for part 3 of 3 in this initial series of work sessions to really get into the detail of these proposed code updates that will help, inform the final direction for the code, as well as help get you familiar with the content as we move towards the adoption process. So, look at this. We have some check marks. As I mentioned, this is our 3rd of 3 work sessions. We're going through the code. So here we are in February. We've talked with the city, and the city will lead, an additional opportunity in March for you all to discuss, anything that feels like loose ends. We'll do a little bit of strategizing for that at the end of this meeting, as Steve mentioned, before heading into the adoption process. So we understand that, one, our work is scheduled to complete, but also there's some exciting developments at the city with City Hall moving forward and literal moving happening. So we want to be sure to help move you forward and get this code in place to help apply to any new developments that come forward. Make sure that they reflect the standards we spent so much time talking about and the priorities that are driving your work. So again, as Steve mentioned, we had heard that perhaps an easier way to handle this discussion, which is really technical and has a lot of details, would be just to make sure we're literally on the same page tonight. So, we're continually innovating as we do this. Maybe we'll get it right on our 3rd try here. And just talk through sort of what's in this memo, some of these details. My overall approach is to just go through, this table that gives you more of an overview. We'll talk through this more generally first, so you have a sense of what the different components of this package of code, what are in these three divisions. And then there's a few particular there's 3 topics that I've pulled out, as well as, one of those about parks and open space just seems so important that, and so reflected in council priorities that there's an additional short, very short memo with some further questions, and we'll get to that as we get into that third of 3 more in-depth topics tonight. But to start with an overview, we can knock one out right away. Division 5 is called General Standards, very creatively named. It's a very simple section, just has some basic things about, like, if you have a chimney, it can project into the setback, or your eaves can project into the setback, that apply across all zone standards. We talked with the city's consulting planner, Scott White, and he said these standards are used, and so just really no changes that were needed, but we're including them in the packet so that you can see what's there, and that, again, that there's not a whole lot to worry about from a policy standpoint there. Just some minor administrative changes. When we get into Division 6 and Division 7, excuse me, really work together. Division 6 talks about the application requirements, and so this lays out more of the procedures. And then Division 7, Division 6 talks more about the different standards that apply to specific review types, so things like conditional uses, subdivisions. And then Division 7 talks more about the logistical requirements in terms of procedural review. So they work together. Division 6 is perhaps more interesting in terms of policy. So it starts off just with a summary of all the different land use review types that require these 4 different levels of review. Type 1 is a staff level ministerial review. Type 2, we're proposing really significant changes to, so to make that a staff level, what's called an administrative review, to apply limited discretion, rather than requiring every one of those type 2s to go to a planning commission for a public hearing. And that's consistent with really overall planning direction in nearly every jurisdiction that I've worked with, and allows just a lot more responsiveness from the city in reviewing these applications that maybe don't really merit a full public hearing before a planning commission. And we did take a look at the list of uses for those type 2 actions to make sure that anything that does require a lot more discretion, that really does merit planning commission hearing, has been moved into the type 3 category. This is what's called a quasi-judicial review for different land use applications. Those do go to planning commission, and council would only hear those if the case is appealed, except that there's a few categories of zone changes, annexations, and street vacations that would continue to go to city council for a final decision. There is also a type 4 procedure. That's a legislative procedure, which is what you're about to embark on for the comp plan amendments and these zoning code changes. But it doesn't apply to individual land use actions that are property. So with those 3 categories, we can then talk about how those apply to the different categories of land use reviews. So first piece, you can set all the great standards you want. There's always as an opportunity where somebody needs an adjustment to that standard. It doesn't quite fit the property. And so Carlton's code, like all codes, has an opportunity for a variance process. So we just realigned the review types to better match the intended process. So there's a minor variance that can be processed with that new type 2 administrative staff level review. And then still those major variances that are more than a 20% deviation from a numerical standard would continue to go to planning commission for review. The next common land use review procedure is conditional use permits. If you think back to all the different use standards for the various zoning districts, if there's something that is larger or could have impacts on neighboring uses, those are traditionally require this conditional use review. And most new or major modifications of conditional uses are going to require that type 3 Planning Commission review. There is a category for some minor modifications to existing ones that could be processed with a staff level review. Next land use review procedure is a site design review. This is most commonly used for commercial, industrial, and downtown developments, so really non-residential. But it also applies to residential development with more than 1 or 2 units on a property, particularly if there is no land division that goes with it. So multifamily housing, for example, the cottage cluster process we've talked about, those would all come through the site design review process. And so since there's both non-residential and residential development, we need to make sure that there's 2 categories here that are very creatively named: major site design review for those new non-residential developments, and a minor site design review. And it's minor in the sense that it would be a type 1 ministerial process, not minor in the sense that the scale of development is necessarily that small. However, the issue with residential development is that state law requires, and we've worked in earlier sections of code to ensure that the standards for residential development are clear and objective. So things like numerical density standards. And then the state further requires that the city uses a clear and objective review process, generally completed by staff, to review those developments. And ensure permits are issued efficiently. So we've aligned the site design review standards with those requirements. There are some exemptions. As I mentioned, larger residential development needs site design review, but a single family home or a duplex or up to 2 attached townhouses are exempt from site plan review because the individual lots have already been reviewed through the subdivision process. We saw some opportunities to, simplify and streamline some of the approval criteria, the procedures and standards that apply to site design review. These aren't policy changes in terms of removing requirements. It's just wording them a little more clearly for applicants and staff to follow. And then, similar to variances, where there are design standards, we've built into the site design review process an opportunity to propose an alternative design to Planning Commission to review through that type 3 review process. So if somebody has a really creative use for downtown, for example, there is a pathway for that. Similar use, non-conforming use, these are more technical parts of the code that come up. Really minor revisions there to keep them functioning. And then we get into different options for land division. So there's 3 different processes. Partitions apply to any land division that creates 2 to 3 lots. Expedited land divisions is a new option that implements state statutes. That can be a land division of any size, but it's kind of a wonky statute. It's not commonly used, but it is required by state law, and it has a narrower set of approval criteria. The applicant agrees to, some limitations, and then there's as it says, an expedited review process that takes less time for the complete decision. So updated those standards and made them clearer. And then the third piece, most commonly used, is the subdivision process. So anywhere where there are 4 or more lots being created, you're going to see a subdivision process. And then there's also, the Carlton Code does include this option for planned unit developments, which are meant to be a more flexible alternative to subdivisions. Once we talk through the subdivisions, we'll talk about how PUDs have worked and what's in the code about those. But the subdivision chapter, I would definitely pay attention to these standards. We're going to talk more about it this evening because a lot of these merit further review. But because subdivision standards are really where the city can exercise a lot of the priorities we've heard around creating that variety of housing, creating more flexibility, creating more open spaces integrated into new developments. So these really are the key standards that are going to drive those new neighborhoods and new developments, and give you the opportunity to insert some additional guidance. Of course, as was alluded to, elsewhere in the memo, and we've talked about to date, the city doesn't have unlimited power to tell developers how subdivisions need to be built. Still needs to be consistent and proportionate to the scale of development being proposed. But there are some opportunities here that hopefully address some of your concerns to date. So this preliminary plat approval criteria, for one thing, we pulled it out and made it a new section, which should just, help organizationally. We relocated some standards, cleaned them up, made it clear where the cross references are within the code. Essentially, anybody that wants to create a subdivision needs to comply with all the base zone standards, the public improvement standards we talked about in Division 3. And then is really where the city gets to add some specific standards. So the ones I'd call your attention to first are, we inserted a provision for lot size averaging, and that would allow someone, say the R1 minimum lot size is 7,500 square feet. And those lot sizes could be reduced by up to 10% for an individual lot. So 750 square feet less is 6,750 square feet, as long as the average lot sizes in the whole subdivision continue to meet that 7,500. So that can just be really helpful in larger developments where there might be natural resources or other site constraints, and just creates some more variety rather than like a real cookie cutter approach. So let me just finish this section and then we'll take a little time for discussion. So that's one component that is new for your consideration. Next piece follows up on some discussion we had back in December about creating a variety of housing types. So as you might recall, the MX, the mixed use or mixed density residential zone, requires a variety of residential types so that no more than 75% of dwellings can be the same type. And we had a conversation about whether that should be extended to other residential zones. And the direction was to create something in the subdivision standards so that larger developments in any residential zone would be subject to a similar standard. And so I picked 30 units as the size for a larger subdivision. If it's smaller than that, it might not be feasible to create that kind of variety. But once you get over that, asking developers, requiring them to mix in some different dwellings, we would expect that many developments would choose to do 75% single family detached, but then it does require some additional cottage units or duplex or townhouse units. So that's the opportunity there. The one exception to the standard would be if somebody's building a multifamily apartment building, it's not really consistent with or the overall direction to require, say, a mix of single family homes there. That's really a very different development type. So that wouldn't be required. And if someone's doing a cottage cluster of 12 cottages, well, they all need to be cottages. So we just, added an allowance there that the cottage cluster can be all cottages, exempt from that standard. And then the other key piece that we'll discuss in more detail, but we added some tree preservation requirements for, when someone comes into a large site, and either to preserve or replace existing large trees. So I'll take a breath and give you all a chance to digest some of what we heard, but specifically these preliminary plat approval criteria and how they'd affect new subdivisions. Interested to get your feedback on this lot size averaging, the housing variety, and then if we want to talk about some existing or some initial thoughts on tree preservation, great, but also we have some more time reserved later.
Great. Do we have any questions or comments from in the room, please?
A quick question about the expedited land divisions based on the state statute. You said this is rare, right? Did I hear that right?
Yeah.
And can you give me like an example that might take place?
So I've heard land use attorneys say that the expedited land division is something they they threaten cities with. Like most people start off using a subdivision process. But if discussions become really contentious, and the developer maybe doesn't see a way to move their project through, then they can choose to opt into these expedited land divisions. And it narrows the criteria both for the developer and in terms of what the city can apply, and tightens that timeline. It limits some appeal options. I think you get to LUBA faster. So it's generally not popular because it hampers both parties. Cities aren't going to be the ones to recommend this expedited land division. It got into statute, really at the request of developers, and just hasn't really solved the problem in the sense that it isn't commonly used. It doesn't seem to offer a substantial savings over the traditional subdivision process.
Thank you for that explanation.
Yeah, I can only think of one city I've worked with that has seen an application like this, and that was a uniquely contentious site that went to LUBA several times.
Other questions from in the room?
Yeah, can you speak to the preliminary plat approval criteria and the new allowance for lot size averaging? And does that differ from previous conversations where we were shrinking lot sizes for all zones? Does that relate? Is that taking the place of that?
Yeah, thanks. So briefly speaking, to go back to sort of the R1, R2, and R3, the only significant lot size decreases that were proposed were in the R3 zone, that would allow more development consistent with the existing density standard for that zone. We just the proposal was to allow smaller lots that actually could achieve the maximum density that's already permitted there. So the lot size the minimum lot sizes for a single family detached and a duplex are not proposed to decrease in the R1 and R2 zones. And what this standard allows is that minimum, as exists in the code and as would be carried forward, could be averaged. There could just be some variety in those lot sizes. So it's not all 7,500 square feet lots. There could be some at, 7,000, some at 7,500, some at 8,000, as long as the overall average hits 7,500 for the R1.
But it applies to all the zoning. So it applies to R1, R2, R3.
Correct.
Same.
Other thoughts or questions on these provisions?
So I guess I do have another follow-up. So then the new requirement that no single housing type can make up more than 75%, but it excludes multifamily and cottage clusters. Can you touch on that a little bit? So am I understanding that if somebody's proposing cottage clusters, then they don't have to meet that? They could put essentially 100% cottage clusters in. They're not held to that 75%.
Yeah. So
you're not going to have somebody could essentially have a bunch of cottage clusters and not mix in single family residential.
correct. I want to say I was thinking about this earlier when I was drafting this code and putting it together. I was thinking how we talked in a previous meeting about the maximum cluster size for up to 12 units. And I was thinking how, well, it's not a cottage cluster if it's not all cottages. So it would be contradictory to the spirit of the cottage code. But thinking back to how that minimum or that maximum of 12 units per cottage, it might make sense to add some variety or some nuance to this standard, because we're talking about the proposed standard addresses subdivisions of 30 units or more. So if the concern is 5 cottage clusters within a subdivision with a total of 60 cottages, it would certainly be feasible to require some variety in there. I think what I was trying to avoid was that any sort of confusion about an individual cottage cluster requiring a mix of units, which would just not meet the definition of a cottage cluster. So if that's something that you would like to see, some variety within a larger development outside of an individual cluster, we could I could add some more specificity.
Any thoughts on that piece before we move on to other questions? Yeah.
Quick question. So I know we talked about, 12, that the cottage cluster couldn't exceed 12 within a cluster. But didn't we also talk about not allowing, cluster after cluster? There had to be some mixture of housing types within a subdivision.
Yeah, we talked about a lot of different issues around cottage clusters. Agreed. And so I think that's why I wanted to offer back that to reflect that conversation, that there might not, it wouldn't make sense to require variety within a cluster, but there could, with this trigger of 30 units, I could add some nuance to the standards that there is variety if there are multiple clusters being proposed. I think that was a piece that I missed.
Is that a change that counselors would like to see in the final draft that Elizabeth prepares?
Yeah, just personally, I think what I was envisioning is trying to avoid having, I know some people spoke to not having all single family residential, but I also want to apply that to where it's not all multifamily and it's not all just cottage clusters. So I don't know the nuances and how you can, but it seems a little open in there to where we could possibly see the opposite. We could see an entire subdivision of multifamily or an entire subdivision of townhomes or something like that. That's where I was looking for clarification on that.
Is there anyone that doesn't want to see that addressed as Elizabeth suggested? If everyone's on the same page, then that's a change and a modification that we can make. And it seems like, unless I'm hearing some dissent, it seems like folks are supportive of that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm in support of it. We need to, like what Kevin was saying, it doesn't make sense if we're gonna have 30, how I'm hearing it is we have 30 cottage clusters, 12 apiece. That's,
Yeah.
and then you could have 30 townhomes, 2, 3, 4 blocks over or something. It needs to be more of a mixture all the way across the board.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Any other questions or comments about the provisions that Elizabeth has presented thus far?
One last question. Can we move the 30 units up or down by 2? That way we could have an ability to get a true 25%.
I was thinking about the same thing. It was driving me a little nuts.
Yeah,
Yeah. So I don't know. Does 32 sound good?
that's right.
28. It should be 28. If this group wants diversity, it should go down, not up.
28 's fine with
either
me
way.
too. It's a simple numbers thing.
Sounds good.
Right. I also wondered about that. And I was like, well, if it can't exceed 75%, then that just means you have to round up with your units, right? You can't do 7.8 units. You have to do the full 8. But yeah, easier to just do 28.
Okay.
Great. Any other questions or comments on these provisions?
I keep looking at the tree survey, but our surveyor is missing tonight, so I.
Oh, all right. Well, we have some more details to talk about in that one. So let's just continue with our overview. So our next piece talks we're also going to discuss this in a lot of detail, but this is the part of code to talk about open space requirements in new subdivisions. So I included 2 code options just to give you an idea of what's out there. And then I think we can further talk about whether either of them is really on the right track or if there's something else that we're working would better meet the council's needs. But that's the section of code where it would go. And then the second piece for subdivision is the final plat. So just added some standards to that. There were some date adjustments that were recommended in some of our initial stakeholder interviews that would make it more feasible, more aligned with industry practices and how the county records the plats. So trying to make those easier. And then
Elizabeth, I have a question on the plat change to go
Please.
from submitted versus recorded. Is that the more common deadline that you see around the state?
Yeah, I would say so because cities can control and can measure when a plat is submitted. When the county gets around to recording it, like the city has no leverage over the county. So that can just be anxiety producing for city and the applicant, mostly the applicant. But it's a fairer standard for a city to apply and a more common standard to require submittal by a certain date.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Last 2 procedures are a zone change if somebody wants a different zone for their property, so minor changes to that. And then the last one, it talks about annexation. So one change there to remove any references to voter approved annexations, which is just changed at the state level due to some Oregon Court of Appeals decisions. However, the city limits and the city's UGB are currently congruent. So there's no land that is in the city's UGB that could be annexed at this point. So these annexation provisions are really not going to be exercised anytime soon, but we did just improve them to align with state law. So then the third of these that we'll get into, Division 7, is more the administrative procedures part, as I mentioned, with those 4 different types of review. This spells out like a lot more details, like what the notification radius is, how many days you get for this and for that, and for review procedures, and how the quasi-judicial hearing procedures need to run. So Scott was really helpful in working with us to update this to be consistent with what he's seen and is comfortable implementing for the city. So a few changes here was adding a codified requirement for pre-application conferences. And that's just an opportunity before a developer submits an application when maybe they have some initial plans to sit down, and the city can help guide the applicant about these are the standards that are going to apply. Particularly, it's a useful time to talk about public improvements, engineering standards that are going to apply to the site, so that any plans and applications that then do get submitted have the benefit of that initial conversation. Also helps applicants so that they're not surprised to submit a plan and hear like, oh, this is the first time I'm hearing about floodplain standards. So common requirement in other cities. I understand, sometimes offered in the city, but this just codifies it, makes it a requirement for those more major type 3 applications that are substantial new development and subdivisions, and optional for some of the type 2, more moderate, shall we say, applications. Procedures for type 1, that's the ministerial review. It's pretty straightforward. You turn in your application, it either meets, the clear standards or it doesn't. So just minor modifications there. The procedures for type 2 and type 3, there's some significant changes in the code because of that change to focusing type 2 on the staff level administrative review and type 3 as a quasi-judicial with the planning commission hearing. So pulling those two things apart, previously they'd been a lot more similar with both type 2 and 3 going to planning commission. So there's some need here to change the standards to more clearly differentiate. There's a common practice that similar to pre-ops recommended for codification, that if you turn in multiple applications, say you need a type 2 site design review, but you also need a type 3 conditional use permit, that gets consolidated into a single review at the highest level of review. And that's just a more efficient and common practice to get everything reviewed concurrently. Updated public notice requirements. And what else do I want to highlight here? With the changes to type 2 and type 3, in terms of type 2 being a staff level review, and type 3 being a planning commission review, there was a necessity to review the appeal procedures to make sure that there was one, but only one opportunity for a local appeal before an application, before it's considered the final local decision. The city has to complete that final review within 120 days, or I think it's actually been increased to 127 days for some nuances. But the city has to complete the review. And if the city, for example, the type 2 review, if a type 2 could be appealed to planning commission and then appealed to city council, building in enough time for those appeals, potential appeals, to be completed would result in a very cramped review timeframe for a type 2 application. And so the proposal is to ensure planning commission will hear appeals of type 1 and 2 decisions, and city council would hear appeals of type 3 decisions. Except there's a couple zone changes, annexations, and road vacations already require a planning commission and city council hearing. So they wouldn't need a further appeal. And then if an applicant or the city or any other party withstanding is not pleased with the decision or takes issue with it, any of these final local decisions could then be appealed on to LUBA. But that's the proposal on appeals. And then the final piece, as I mentioned, there are type 4 actions for the legislative review for things like this development code updates, as well as the comprehensive plan update that you'll be working on in coming months, and just clarifications to those standards to ensure that there's a hearing before planning commission and city council consistent with current practices. So any questions about division 7 here?
I just, can I ask a clarifying question? On that appeals process, I just want to make sure I understand it right. Planning commission, the way we're proposing it is planning commission will not hear type 1 and type 2. That'll come at a staff level, and then if it's appealed, then it goes before, it's not the planning commission hearing it twice, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Right.
Didn't you say if there was a type 2 and 3 that they'd be combined?
Oh, if someone had 2 land use applications for the same property that were different types, they would be combined and reviewed as a type 3. But not, an application might be just a type 2 or a type 1, in which case the decision would be made at the staff level and could be appealed to planning commission.
I apologize. Previously, I asked for comments in the room, but I neglected to ask if there were any questions or comments from our counselor or planning commissioner online. So please know that the floor is open to you too, in addition to folks in the room. Any questions in the room, comments, or online? Okay. I think we're good, Elizabeth.
Okay, so some key topics that I pulled out, I think this is more for your background than to talk about tonight, but just provided some more detail on these type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4 review types. again, just the biggest change is moving to this type 2 administrative review rather than taking all type 2 applications through a quasi judicial process. While retaining the type 3 quasi judicial process with the planning commission hearing for really those projects that have more discretion. So that's your new subdivisions, new site design review applications for non-residential development, conditional uses, of course, variances. So that is the biggest change here. I know we just talked about this, but any other questions about how these would apply to the different land use actions in the county or in the city, excuse me?
Is this something that we're seeing generally as a trend, doing this kind of review, or?
Absolutely. This is very, very standard. You learn it in year 1 in planning school and pretty consistently applied across the state. It was pretty unusual that the city of Carlton had a type 2 review that went to the planning commission. That was one of the things that stood out in the code, even in the initial audit back last year.
So when we say administrative, that, is it fair to say that that goes through city staff and or Scott?
Correct.
There's a notice that goes out for the type 2 as well. So property owners are informed of the proposal prior to staff making the decision. And that notice of the type 2 process identifies a period of time to which they can come in, take a look at it. If they have a concern about it, they can say that to staff. And by submitting something during that notice period, they get the standing to appeal the decision. So they are automatically required to receive that decision. And so they'll have an appeal period in that event. But all of that adds up a lot of time. So what Elizabeth described there as just one appeal, we're able to fit that within that 120-day processing period that the state requires.
Thank you.
When you say property owners, are you talking about residents in general, or do you have a specific boundary?
Yeah, good question. So it is, it's a boundary from the, it's extended from the boundary, whatever that parcel looks like in shape. You go out, I believe it's 100 feet. I don't know if I would take a check, just take a look, but yeah, all of the property owners within the extreme boundaries.
There's a certain limit that you put on, yeah.
Correct, yeah.
If somebody were not within that limit, can they come into the hearing, or is that they're not party to it?
So generally it's not, they're outside the boundary, they would not receive notice. They might receive it in some other way.
It's a small town, word gets around.
Generally, what the notices that we prepare say, if you're, it just has to go out to the property owner as, take track of who's a renter or not. It's pretty much a property owner notification, but I think that at least some of the notices I prepare, they say, if you're the owner, not the occupant of, send this to, please send it over to the residents there.
Or if there were, you've got the neighborhood and it's here that they're doing something, and there are people out here who are outside of the limit, the boundary. That's what I'm thinking, because I can see that happening also. Is that, or that desire?
Yeah.
They'd still be permitted to, there'd be no restriction on them submitting comments. They just wouldn't receive that mailed notice.
Okay,
Correct.
that's
That's
yeah.
a good clarification of what
Thank
was
you.
provided.
So the type 1 doesn't receive that notice?
Correct. So a lot of the type 1 applications are the routine applications that meet all of the criteria for review. A lot like a sign permit application is a good type 1 example, where if it meets all of the sign criteria as part of the code, they receive approval. And it is possible for the applicant to appeal that decision. So that's where you get the the appeal mostly from type 1, it would be an applicant that does not like a condition of approval or something like that, or the city's denial of the type 1 if that occurs. But in most cases, it's a proposal, small in scope and scale, that clearly meets the approval criteria and development standards.
Thank you.
All right. So next key issue that I had wanted to pull out for additional discussion is we've heard as part of the comp plan, and then as we've been developing the code, about the importance of tree preservation and if necessary, replacement of those trees at the time of development. And so as mentioned, the development or the subdivision standards include a proposed standard to map existing trees, and they defined, the big trees that we're going to care about as having a diameter of 10 inches or more, and to either preserve with the requirement to preserve or replace those trees at a 1-to-1 ratio. And so, I'd say this is a really broad topic, right, about tree preservation. Some cities have 20, 40 pages of code just about tree preservation. And we heard that there was an interest to identify and preserve these trees, but an interest in a fairly simple code approach to this. So this comes out of something I worked on with the city of Redmond in Central Oregon. This was a standard that they landed on for their subdivision ordinance that they just updated last year. It's fairly generic in terms of we're identifying large trees, we're preserving them, we're replacing them. Some cities also have an option to pay a fee in lieu of the replacing that the city can add to sort of a tree fund to plant elsewhere in the city, and or for the developer themselves to plant trees elsewhere in the city, replacing the trees off-site rather than on-site if there's not room for that. Which is all to say there's a lot of complexities in tree codes. What is a tree worth saving? It's sort of there are ways to define it, but there are elements that are in the eyes of the beholder or in the community. Sometimes there are, complex exceptions about the health or the species of trees. There may just to refine sort of like which trees are worth saving. Are there any legitimate reasons to remove them without triggering replacement? Certainly these standards have come up a lot in the wake of the recent ice storm. If you've been following some of city discussions about not necessarily with new development, but with existing properties where trees might have been lost due to the storm, and the idea of replanting, may or may not seem feasible. So there can be a lot of complexity around tree codes. And so this is something, to begin the discussion, and curious to hear your feedback about, does this help address the issues that you're looking at? Or do you want to keep working on a more detailed set of tree preservation standards, at a later date outside of this process? Again, like we have some, have brought forward an option. It could work. But I am not a tree code expert, so I would turn it over to you to hear more about your city priorities and what you might like to see reflected in the code.
I think, excuse me, due to the complexity, I would be in favor of handling this separately. And taking, a deeper look at the issue.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how that works exactly. I go back to JR too, because what they did to that subdivision area was essentially log it. They had a huge stand of fir trees in there, and they logged it. They took out everything. So what do you do with something like that where, they kind of, their point was that they needed the space for the houses. So I'm not going to argue that. There are houses now where the trees were standing, but what do you, yeah, how do you reconcile something like that?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. I would say communities and at the state level too, there's been a lot of policy discussions about, should cities, be allowed to require preservation of trees when it's on a lot that could be developed for housing, which we've identified, as a state is in dire need. So balancing those two is a really complex equation.
I also think that preservation of non-native tree species would be against what we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need to have an exclusion around the non-native trees.
Mm-hmm.
I do like the idea of maybe it's 10 inches or whatever that number is, you know what I mean? To identify older, more the trees that need to be saved or preserved or
So,
replaced
yeah,
versus a 1-to-1 for everything. But I also agree I think there's a lot of complexities that it'd be hard to just
Yeah.
put a broad standard out there.
As I recall with JR2, a lot of the issue was the types of some trees that, particular trees, and there was an argument, I don't know. It's going back and forth about, what they were willing to save versus not. They came back with a list. So, I mean, if we had something codified, I think it would avoid a lot of those issues.
Yeah, there definitely is a lot of complexities to this because some neighborhoods have dealt with trees that are 80 years old and at the end of life, and they've had to remove them. And they didn't look that big to me. So if we're saving an 80-year-old tree that's at an end of life that has a 10-inch base, I mean, that's,
yeah.
we may be causing additional harm to people that are trying to move in and develop, so.
I think one of the things that we were talking about in there, did I see, yeah, species and or health of the trees, and that's, when you start looking at older trees, you're probably looking at something that you're gonna have to do you may have to do some remediation on just because it's an old tree.
Is it a requirement or is it possible that is borne on the developer to hire, versus the city, because we're talking about the capacity and the expertise to review these surveys. Is it possible to say that if the developer has to have a tree survey done to identify dead trees, to identify?
Sure. So
I don't think we have any tree experts on staff, so.
What you're saying, Kevin, say if we have, JR2, we'll use that one, that seems to be the most example. Where they plotted out where they wanted all the houses, where they could do that as an overlay to the ground of where all the trees are. And I'm sure quite a few of those trees could have been saved and they were just in the backyards. Or maybe one in the front yard or something. And they just go through and do more, not a clear cut, but a thinning.
Oh, yeah, they could have done a thinning.
Right, that's what I'm saying. If they do an overlay of the houses over the ground, they can see where they are. They're gonna plot all that out. And something where that we put that on the developer.
What does it look like if we say we don't really know if we support this standard and more or less kick the can down the road? Who's that falling on? Is that falling on the planning commission? Future us? Like what is that? That's my worry, is saying, oh, it's too complex, we don't want to do anything. And then the next subdivision comes in and people are outraged because all the trees were cut.
Well, when I was saying that we should handle this separately, I was meaning sooner rather than later.
Right, yeah, I just didn't know if we adopt the code, then when does that happen?
And how long is that process? Especially since we just said it's complex.
we adopt the code, we do still have the opportunity or the change it. But as we, like Kevin said, we kick and chase that can down the road.
But if you completely remove it, let's say this is adopted in June and becomes the law of the city of Carlton in June, and if you completely have removed it, there's nothing in place, as the council president has said, the next subdivision. If it's completely removed.
Yeah.
Sounds like it's wise to have it in there, but it's also really wise to bring it back to the table and visit this really quick.
Well, that is a policy decision, whether it's wise to put it in there or not, but.
And just one piece to clarify based on your discussion, is that the standards would be written to require the developer to complete a tree survey, and it could also include an arborist's report. I've worked in cities where those are the requirements. You can certainly require the developer to do that. I think the question is, does the city have the interest and expertise to review those reports? And do you, trust them, for lack of a better word? So.
Well, it's basically more than we have now, right?
Mhm.
Good place to start.
I seem to recall with JR2 that they did do a survey and there was something about the health of certain trees. I just have a recollection of that. But it was done after a lot of, contention on the topic. So an automatic.
Yeah, you could certainly require that tree survey and the arborist report as application requirements for the subdivision.
With the understanding that a certain number of those trees will be retained.
Well,
If
that's the second
possible.
piece, right?
Yeah.
I think if there is a desire to have an understanding that some of those trees be retained, then that needs to be a standard. So that's either retain all the trees over 10 inches or retain all the 25% of the existing trees. I mean, right. To make it an understanding, there needs to be a standard. And that's the complexity about, some sites have a bunch of trees, so some would be enough. Some trees are more important than others. We've heard native species, healthy species, trees that aren't at the end of their life cycle, trees located in backyards, not building footprints. So yeah, lots of nuance about which trees to pick.
I'm definitely not an expert on this by any means, but if you're doing an elevation change, like if you're digging down your lot 2 feet and you have a tree on there, and that root ball is now above grade, you really couldn't keep that tree in that area safely. I mean, like I said, I'm not an expert. I don't know much about this, but it just coming from somebody who grew up on a farm, I don't think that would be we'd have to take it case by case scenario, I think. Especially if there's, if you're doing any digging or moving of dirt.
What have we seen in other communities or in other situations? Has there been something, obviously not an industry standard, but has there been something that stands out as far as a logical approach?
I think this is a really hard one, to be honest. I think many communities want to see those trees preserved, and the sheer logistics of trying to get development on lots, the disruption, the site disturbance just often means that the trees can't easily be preserved. And it takes I've seen tree preservation standards in much larger communities that have the complexity as well as the staff nuance. It takes reviewing the applications. To your excellent point, Counselor, it takes site inspections to make sure that root zones are properly protected during construction if those are trees to be preserved. So I've definitely seen larger cities have more success and capacity to implement more.
I would
complex-
concur with Elizabeth, and I work with some cities that have extensive tree standards that have the three-part of surveying the trees and all that kind of thing, and then the standards, a certain percentage to sort of keep them, but the exceptions. And then all of the protection standards that go in with, root ball and making sure that the fencing is out to the drip line beyond the root ball of the tree. So there's a lot of great examples out there, a lot of cities that have put together a lot of time. I can't think of any example where it's gone through sort of a comprehensive, inclusive of something we're doing here. There's a couple of counselors that have acknowledged the complexity. It is complex, and Elizabeth is correct. There are some jurisdictions that have several pages of code devoted to it. Protection standards, an arborist report, process of review, and it certainly is. If you decide you want it, it's deserving of knowing what that can be. What's I think just proposed here is a simple, hey, a submittal requirement that a developer would be required to at least show an arborist report, maybe to answer some questions if there's those who are out there that want to know, hey, is that tree healthy or not? Well, an arborist report says it is or it isn't. That's an asked and answered sort of situation. And maybe that's the end of that conversation. But there wouldn't be a standard that we're proposing here right now to protect the tree. And there's lots of good reasons. I'll just mention too, seen a lot of plans, development applications where it's clearly necessary to disturb the ground to make it work with respect to utilities and grading so other properties aren't flooded. And anytime you disturb that ground is going to disturb the root zone and all of that stuff. So, and I've seen good intentions too. A lot of development projects that I've reviewed through the years where the tree is kept, and then 5 years later, even though there's bonding and all of that stuff that's in place, the tree dies, and the city has to go after the bond company to collect that bond money, which could be difficult. So, it's lots of work to actually make it effective.
Well, that's encouraging.
I wish it were simpler. I wish good intentions and, solid planning practices were enough on this one, but I think the details really matter, is what I've seen.
Is it fair to say that a lot of the concern around this topic came from the planning commission?
It was conveyed to us as a council priority.
I guess I was getting to the point of, I know some of the council or commissioners are passionate about trees and things like that, and it's unfortunate they're not here to lend their advice, or maybe some of them are.
Yeah, it's not just from the council. I mean, it's not just from the commission.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
I wouldn't say we got specific individuals. It's just an overall direction we've heard about community priorities on trees that we wanted to be responsive to, but also knowing that
Generally through the city, there is a vein of concern about it. It's just a matter of figuring out how we address that.
So if I may just summarize, or maybe Elizabeth, you can just represent the options that you included in the memo here. I don't want to misspeak. I heard some desires to have something in place, but maybe look at, continue to look at this over time, but I don't want to misstate anything. So can you repeat the options that, as far as you see it, for council tonight?
Yeah, thanks. That's pretty much it. There is some proposed code language that, is fairly focused and simple about requiring a tree survey. We could add in an arborist report on the health of those trees as well. And then, it's a pretty simple standard that's being proposed that any tree 10 inches or more either has to be preserved or replaced at a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, if you're replacing a 50-year-old tree or, a large tree at 10 inches or more with a brand new tree, you're not going to get the same canopy, but you're going to get something. And that does provide some flexibility, again, for the city where that grove of firs needs to come out because it's in the middle of a road or something, or in the backyards of everyone's homes, and it's just not going to be feasible to preserve them with all the site disturbance. So, that is the option on the table. If there's some minor refinements to that or direction, for example, excluding a non-native species, we could easily bring that back in the final code. But to add more of these layers of complexity that many of you have rightly pointed out would really suggest the opportunity for a later process after the adoption of this code update.
I guess I would be comfortable with what you're suggesting.
At a minimum, yeah, absolutely.
I'm comfortable with that. I would be a little bit uncomfortable if we were replacing a mature tree with another mature tree, because that would make the expense of the building project astronomical. So replacing it with a new, younger tree, that would keep it in the affordable realm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Do
Right.
others support that approach of moving forward with what's been proposed? And then should council want to do some further digging through a separate process and further discussions on these complexities that you've all discussed tonight, that could happen as a separate process? Is there some consensus for that?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. Just a great discussion. It's a very complicated topic.
Yeah, I don't envy you making the decision. So thanks for that discussion. So next one, equally or more important when we're talking about new subdivisions, is we have talked a lot and heard a lot about the importance of integrating open space into new subdivisions. And so, certainly this is a broader topic in the sense that, open space can mean parks, it can mean trails, it can mean, undisturbed natural areas. It can be areas for access or areas that have ecological value. It could be, areas for active recreation or passive recreation. And so, the city has an existing parks development plan that talks more to the active recreational needs of the city. And, we heard that on top of that, there was an interest in some additional requirements for new subdivisions to create these spaces sort of as the city builds out and integrate them. And so, again, this is a very legitimate and common interest and priority, and it is a very complex issue to implement. So just to start off by saying the city is not alone in trying to find a way to make this feasible. And I think what I'm hoping our discussion can lead us to tonight is a little more clarity on what the desired outcomes are so that we can make sure that we're writing code and other plans that help implement that. So I think because we'd heard this desire for additional open space within developments, but also understanding that because the city already has a parks plan and developments are required to pay parks SDCs, the additional ask for open space within new developments can't duplicate that parks, the facilities that the parks SDCs are supposed to fund, unless you're going to give developers SDC credits and reduce the amount that they have to pay. So the two options that are in code are really intended to offer examples of what a city can require in addition to the parks development plan. So, again, I just worked in the city of Redmond and done a lot of research for them developing their standards. And so, one option is a fairly simple requirement for 150 square feet per dwelling unit to be developed as an active or passive space. That's the same as the open space that's being required for cottage developments, but the exact number could go up or down, to a degree. It doesn't have to be huge. It can't be 10,000 square feet per lot. But there's some flexibility in terms of, is it 100? Is it 200? Is it 300? Somewhere in there would likely be legally defensible, but I am not the city attorney. And then this, another option with a little bit more detail that comes to us from the city of Sherwood, one of our colleagues at 3J, Heather, why am I forgetting Heather's last? Heather Austin. You see, Heather Austin is familiar with their code, and so recommended this as another model for us to consider. And so it has about double the amount of open space when you do the calculations. But still a relatively small amount at 5% of the site area rather than measuring it on a lot basis. And there's more detail in that code example about what that open space needs to look like, if it can be dedicated to the public or how it's maintained, some additional provisions to allow density transfer from that area to other parts of the development, which can help diffuse any concerns about legal takings. So there's more detail in that, but all in all, whether it's option A, option B, or some combination of those two, you're looking at relatively small facilities, what are termed mini parks in the parks development plan, within a moderate size subdivision. So that's sort of what I have seen professionally in other cities as sort of the limit of what a city can require in addition to their parks plan through new subdivision development. So the third option is really to go back to that parks development plan. It's due for an update this year at the city based on the 5-year review cycle, and to really, focus in on that strategy of the parks development plan, collecting those parks SDCs to fund the improvements that are outlined, with some additional requirement or detail in the parks development plan about parkland acquisition. So I have a number of questions here, and then because I had all these questions, there's a supplemental memo that hopefully you received, I believe went out on Friday, talking about this issue in detail. So let me, from the group, would you like to start this conversation or go through some of those pieces in the additional memo before we start opening it up for broader discussion?
Preferences?
I'd like to go through it.
Okay.
It's
Great.
just me. I'm only one.
You made a decision, you're stuck with it. That's good.
All right. Well, I think it will help
Yeah.
add to our discussion. So thank you for listening to me talk some more. So again, we've got these 3 options that are in the memo, and 2 options that are code examples in your draft code. And thinking about some of these, as mentioned, the options 1 and 2, right, are most likely to create these relatively small open space facilities that are akin to, what the parks plan calls mini parks. These could be private, they could be public. And it's really just designed, the code is written so that, there's no double dipping by requiring subdivisions to build additional facilities already planned and funded through the parks development plan. And so that's, whether it's the square feet per dwelling or the 5%, those wind up in the range of 150 to 300 square feet per dwelling. And, that's sort of what you get. So, going back to the long range plans that the city has, the city has identified the need to acquire additional land for those larger facilities, the neighborhood and community parks. That's in the Parks Development Plan. It's in the proposed comprehensive plan. The proposed comprehensive plan talks about working with encouraging developers, whether that's through code requirements or other productive conversations, to dedicate parkland as part of land use. And so, options 1 and 2, the ones in the draft code, would not necessarily bring the city closer to getting these neighborhood and community parks. They would provide an additional type of open space recreational amenity within new developments, and then parks SDCs as collected for that development would continue to be collected by the city to fund that neighborhood and community park acquisition. And so, so that's sort of what could be accomplished under options 1 and 2. To dig more into option 3, I don't want to cavalierly say like, just implement the parks plan. So there are some opportunities thinking through that, how that could be further strengthened, that might better align with these long-term parks development goals from these other long-range planning documents. So first of all, the city could work with the new parks development plans scheduled for any time this year or after. I shouldn't say scheduled. The update review cycle, it's been updated every 5 years. And so this is the 5th year. So there is the opportunity to review it. Now, I can't speak to whether it is on the city's official work plan or not, but that is sort of the periodic cycle that you're on. So that could include, right now it talks about how many acres of additional neighborhood and community parks would be required to serve development, but it doesn't talk anything about where the priority locations are, or necessarily map them out or identify what types of facilities would go where. So there could be more detail in the plan. Similarly, there could be more detail about trail corridors, either in that parks development plan or the TSP process that you've already started, or will soon start. So there's some opportunities there. And we could also, tie these things together by adding something in the subdivision standards that they comply with the parks development plan, so that if there are these, trail corridors or park acquisition targets identified, that a new subdivision would be required to dedicate those facilities at the time of development. So, that would take effect once those plans, the Parks Development Plan or the TSP, incorporated that level of detail. But we could get it into the code so that they would work together. We could also add, right now there's just nothing in the code that talks about whether the city will accept parkland dedication at the time of new subdivision. So that's a pretty low lift in terms of code language, that we could add something saying, say the developer wants to dedicate that stand of large trees to the city to use as a parkland because it has value to the city for recreation and doesn't necessarily to the developer, or they really would like to see some areas dedicated as a park. That would give the city more ability to accept those dedications and make it part of the subdivision discussion. And so those pieces of option 3 could help really focus on the creation of more of the neighborhood and community parks. Wouldn't likely lead to any of those mini parks, especially if those are not identified in the parks development plan. So taking that all together, I think the most critical question that I have for you all and for you all to consider is, really what are the open space priorities for new subdivisions that you would like to see reflected in code? Is it focusing on these neighborhood and community parks? Or is it, adding these additional types of facilities like mini parks, or yet some other category of open space? And how can that be reflected in new development?
Elizabeth, did those questions you had on the bottom of the previous memo, are those something to go over? Or did you just kind of do that through your presentation?
I'd say let's start here and we can go back.
Okay,
We want to get into some of those specifics, but really thinking like option 1, option 2, option 3 is sort of the first direction, and then we could drill down on some details.
sounds good.
I think within a in a subdivision, I would rather see an area within a subdivision designated as opposed to, 150 square feet per dwelling unit.
Something that could maybe become more of a community
Exactly.
area for the
As
subdivision.
opposed to,
Yeah.
I think taking JR 2 or 1 or whatever it is, as an example right now. That developer had created the pocket park right up at the front near the apartment building.
Mhm.
And it's very small and awkward to use because it's on a slope. And I very rarely see children there. And then the other part is in the back and it's apparently a winding, very weird trail. So leaving it up to the developers and taking what they give us seems unsatisfactory.
It's a little problematic in that
And
case.
I don't know how you can approach it from a map point of view, that when the developer says, okay, I want to make, 500 houses here, that then we say, it would be wonderful to have this center part be the green area at,
right.
a quarter of an acre, or what would be our size. So I don't know how we as council and even our planning commission can have that foresight of planning, looking even at our areas. If we made pretend maps of, suppose we put a subdivision there and suppose this was the park, how do you go about doing that ahead of time? I don't know. So do they do that in other cities? Do they kind of make a pre-plan for any of their existing?
Yeah, well, I guess I would want to tease apart a couple different threads here, right? So if we're talking about more of these tot lots, like say a quarter acre that it sounds like you're describing in JR Meadows, I think there's varying levels of degree of specificity that go into city codes. Certainly this desire for it to be centrally located, to not be sloping, to actually be accessible, to actually be usable. Those are all things cities have tried to write in clear and objective ways because they have to be for a subdivision. And it works better on some sites than others, just, due to the, shall we say, creativity of developers. So, I mean, rules are written, and if they meet the rules, then, that's a creative occupation. Certainly we're trying to write rules that result in the facilities you want. So I guess in that piece, there are some standards that try to push them in those smaller facilities. If we're talking, I think one piece that would be really helpful for me to hear from you all and to help advise you further on these code pieces is, are those the type of facilities that you're looking for in new subdivisions? Because if your neighborhood parks, are larger in Carlton's Parks Development Plan, larger than 1.5 acres, that's more parks land than you're going to need, be likely to get in a subdivision, even up to 50, 100 units. That's a substantial amount of land. So getting a neighborhood park, those locations I've certainly seen identified, not necessarily on a parcel level, but sort of within, a general vicinity of a city. And community parks, same thing. Community parks are the largest unit of park. So 10 acres or more sometimes. So those are often identified in parks development plans in more specific locations.
I'm thinking more in terms of more passive open spaces as opposed to like every subdivision should have an actual active park.
Mm-hmm.
But just, I mean, it doesn't mean that you use it for any, recreation. It's just passive open space. It does not have a structure or cement on it.
No, no maintenance, no mowing.
Necessarily, if it's, that was so, and that, I guess that's another point about whether we want to
Maintenance and
have any,
upkeep, yeah.
implement any rules about what that has to be, you know. Well, a park requires maintenance too, so.
We look at the 150 square foot per dwelling, I mean. You could take 80 houses and then you by 150, and that gives you your square footage of somewhere for the park.
That's what I'm saying, as opposed to
With
those
it.
little pocket parks.
Identify one
Big area.
contiguous area at least, yeah.
But it is,
But like she said, that with that 150, 7,500 square foot, it would only give you 50 dwellings subdivision. It would only give you 7,500 square foot open space.
Would
So
be,
essentially one lot. If you had a 50 dwelling subdivision by 150, you'd get 7,500.
In terms of, okay, say in terms of the size of this room, what would that equate out to? Twice the size of this room, half the size of this room?
More than that.
Hmm?
I mean, we're
I
talking,
don't, I mean, I don't,
I
I'm
think,
not being. I
what is
just
our
don't-
standard? Our standard R1 lot is 7,500 square feet.
Right.
So like a residential lot. I'm a little bit, maybe I need some clarification. I'm a little bit hesitant, since we do collect SDCs. And how that relates, like you have some wording in there about, what we can legally do. So I'd be a little bit nervous to require and acquire more land and then still collect these park SDCs. I don't know, could somebody speak more to that? Like,
They're different.
they are
We're-
different.
The open space requirements, except for, I guess, option 3, as Elizabeth laid out, the options 1 and 2 are not requiring parks, even though that's a lot of the language. It's not requiring parks that we have in our park development plan, which is what park SDCs are based on. So this would be a separate open space requirement that happens to allow for parks within subdivisions. But we can still charge the park SDCs because they are not building what we have already said we're going to build as our park facilities. So when just looking through this, I feel much more comfortable with any of the language that is further away from parks and more just calling it open space. And then like Councilor Ward Mullen was saying that passive open space counts. I think Councilor Skipper, when we had Gordon here, you were asking about stormwater retention counting as open space. There's kind of lots of options aside from sort of what we all generally think of as park facility. And the amounts that are included in here, I think Elizabeth said it, but they are legally, in my opinion, legally defensible. Would not present any legal issues.
So maybe a little historical context, Scott, if you may, and I know some of this predates you, working for the city, but what are our requirements now? So how did we end up with pocket parks? Is this any different than the 150? And then kind of going back even further, was Hahn Creek a dedicated space? How does anybody in this room know like how we got such a large park in that neighborhood?
The builder.
That was the developer.
Was that just developed?
The developer.
my recollection of that is that it wasn't a requirement of the city, it was the developer offered that as basically to get the buy-in of the community to put in Carlton Crest. But it wasn't a requirement.
Yeah,
how many square feet is on?
I have no idea.
he was, my understanding was that initially he was committed to developing it and then never did.
No, good. But also, I think for JR 1 and 2, I don't think it was a requirement.
There are some situations where properties are encumbered by 100-year floodplain, or maybe a wetland or something like
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
In which case, it may be very difficult to develop, not so much to the city standards, but more at a federal and state level. In which case, the developer says, gee, I can't develop with this anyways. Sometimes it lends itself to what Elizabeth described. We have planned unit development option developed in lieu of doing a subdivision. But there just hasn't been a lot of developers pursuing that option. The PUD actually has open space requirements, and it has dimensional requirements and locational requirements and that sort of thing. So it's actually a good, when I reviewed the code, and I think we did a work session on this very topic, if developers would pick the PUD option and pursue it, you have some very good standards. It's the fact that no, they don't have to pursue that. They have the option to go through the subdivision process and even the expedited subdivision process that Elizabeth described. And so it's sort of like a disappointment recently, so what you've been seeing without the open space in some cases. Sometimes it's a little bit of a small area in JR Meadows 3. There was just sort of this little area that was left over that not much to do with it. And so that was a small area that maybe you can do something with, but yeah, that's what the situation is. I would encourage, if you do say passive, what that is, and especially if it's allowed for a water quality facility, that it be a vegetated water quality facility, not one that's a big, just a large tub that's designed primarily for collection of water. And that's what a lot of cities will do. They'll have the option of passive or active open space, but declare what more complexities of what each is to entail. So anyways, does that answer the question?
So I think to summarize, there's no requirement right now for
Not-
open space
not
and
Yeah, now there is sometimes the zone itself has some standards that have to be applied. So the RX zone is one exception, but the standard R zone that does not have an open space.
According to the Parks Development Plan, Hong Creek is 2.88 acres in size. And at this point was currently undeveloped. It was dedicated as part of the Carlton Crest subdivision. That was granted preliminary approval in June 2005. Includes approximately 1.45 acres within the 100-year floodplain of Hong Creek, and an additional 1.35 acres on either side of Hong Creek that could be developed as a neighborhood.
yeah, part of going back to my, the SDC and the Parks Development Plan is if we don't require something as far as open space, we're gonna run out of options. You know what I mean? So it would be, oh, great, we have this money that we collected from SDCs and the Parks Development Plan, but we can't acquire any land or any land that makes sense to have a park. You know what I mean? Or open space, sorry, not park. That's kind of where I'm a little bit worried about. If we don't do something, then you're gonna continue to build out the city and there's gonna be no open space for acquisition, for open. Sorry, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for requiring that. Yeah, I just want to make, emphasize that it does, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily have to be a recreational park, but
Right.
open space, green.
Grass and trees and bunny rabbits.
So with that being said, then what do you? So it's like we get 150 square foot per building, but basically a lot. You have 750 square foot park or 750 square foot plot of grass, with trees and stuff. Then are they gonna do any kind of trail work or tables or anything, or is it just left natural? Is that what you're saying?
Not necessarily tables. But I mean, Elizabeth, are we limited to the sizes that you're talking about here?
I guess I'm still wanting to hear more when we start talking about sort of undeveloped passive open space. That's an additional category, shall we say, like beyond anything that's planned in the parks plan. And so if that's something that you'd like to see, incorporated into developments, it would, just be interested to hear about the council's sort of policy rationale for requiring that kind of a space or a different kind of a space. Like what's going to provide the most value, in these developments, given that, you can only ask for so much, right? I think is the overall message that it's a certain amount of additional land if this is a route that you go, in addition to the parks development plan. And so, what's the highest and best use? What's the highest priority, in those subdivisions to enhance the community? And also just as a time check, I'd heard that we wanted to reserve 15 minutes at the end to talk about sort of next steps from here. So we've got about 10 minutes until then.
I'm going to 8:30. At 8. Yeah.
Well, I agree with you, Kevin. Yeah, we've got to put something in to start somewhere.
Mhm.
But it doesn't sound like you're not gonna be able to tell a developer, put something in there that says, okay, you've got to provide like concrete 2 acres of property.
So could you speak to the code from the city of Redmond? I mean, does it say active or passive open spaces, and how is that being interpreted? I think it's kind of what your question for us was, like, does that give them the option to create a little neighborhood park? Does that give them the option to have green space or a group of trees? It sounds like it's kind of wide open.
It's on page 49.
Yeah, I was gonna say, why don't we actually go ahead and pull that up real quick. Oh, sorry, let me do the scrolling before I show you, because it's awful to watch other people
Go down
scroll.
there.
Which what?
Morgan, can you?
49.
Whatever.
Oh, maybe not. No. Oh, good. Right about now. Page 49. What's it say, Kevin? You got there first.
And the 5% option does result in about 2.5 times the amount of open space.
Yeah, so.
But we're
and
not
I
said,
think these
sorry, go
numbers-
ahead.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to say any of these numbers could be revised, if you want something more like the city of Redmond, but you'd rather have it, more land, that could be changed to 130, or 300 rather than 150. They're just, I included these two examples because they're varying levels of specificity, sort of structure that we could work within. I guess I would also say the city of Redmond opted not to adopt this standard. They considered it, and then their ultimate direction from Planning Commission and City Council was that the city didn't want more tot lots, that they would rather focus their energy on collecting SDCs and building out the neighborhood and community parks. So, which isn't to say that's your city direction, but just, some context. City of Sherwood just had a lot more details in it. We don't have to take all of these, but I wanted to give you a sense of the kinds of things that the code can speak to, before spending a lot of time refining it.
The part of the Redmond that concerns me is that shall be privately maintained and must be developed. I can't necessarily see, assuming that every subdivision is going to have people that are going to come in and be taking care of that. That ends up putting you back into almost a situation that's guaranteed to cause some real problems.
Yeah, I think the alternative is dedication to the city. And so the question is the city willing to
Yeah.
take on ownership and maintenance of these smaller facilities that, you know, may need mowing, may need garbage removal, may need, you know, whatever.
I prefer the Sherwood model. To the Redmond model.
Mhm.
Do you feel like 5% is quite significantly different, you know? Which I'm not opposed to, but I also, it brings me back to my previous fear of SDCs and then, you know, taking 5% of the land in a smaller subdivision. Maybe there's a happy medium, 3-4%, I don't know.
Yep, all of that's open for discussion.
We aren't taking it, Kevin. Just for any future litigation reasons.
Depends on whose opinion you're asking.
My legal opinion is we're not taking.
G, it allows for FCC credit. Under the Sherwood
For
model.
the, yeah, if the development applies.
Ways under section A may be eligible for parks SDC charges based on methodology identified in the most current parks development plan. Does that give the developers and the residents some kind of a little bit of a wiggle room?
I will say there's been a lot of interest in credits in our developments.
It could give them incentive to come to the table to make more land available. Or, you know what I mean? Versus 5%,
Just, yeah.
no credits, and we're taking our SDCs. There. So, how about it?
Why is it may be eligible and not will be eligible?
I would not recommend the city promise to accept facilities and give credits, just because you don't know what they're going to offer and you don't want to be bound to pay them for it until you see what precisely is going to be proposed. So that decision about parks SDCs, there's a whole SDC methodology, there's a parks development plan, and that is more of a case-by-case decision for the city to make.
It creates a conversation and some leeway of like, does this fit in with the parks development plan? You know what I mean? Maybe there's room for a credit because you've proposed a fantastic idea in our opinion, you know what I mean? Or
Actually, that sounds very correct. So May is correct in this case. Because we want equal value coming across. Or
It may
equal
be
value.
eligible for credit because they can't just build whatever park they want and get
Right.
a parks SDC credit. It's not in any way related to what we have proposed in our parks development plan. What do we call it?
It doesn't, yeah, it doesn't absolutely, it does not absolutely commit us to turn over that property to them, or it doesn't absolutely commit us to creating a park there or giving them SDCs. It's a may.
We can't give them a credit if they build something that is not in our parks.
And that's why it's a May. Nice, and I support that. Language is very important.
Part of the issue with the credits, and I think we've had issues with this before, is that we get a crummy little park because the developer really wants a credit. And that hurts our big parks because we've essentially gotten something that we didn't really want, that we in a back around way paid for.
To continue to build off that and to beat a dead horse. there's been a lot of interest on the developers on the side of 7th Street for credits for the parks that you have been talking about and the trail that you've been talking
Of
about.
course.
And yeah, well, we won't talk about that more tonight. Okay, folks. Need to make a decision here. We
What
got,
is the decision?
I don't know. That's what I said. We need to make a decision. You got 2 minutes.
Well, as I said before, I prefer the model of Sherwood as opposed to Redmond, but that's not filling in the details really. Kevin, your thoughts?
I tend to agree. I just, like I said, seeing the difference with the math on the 150 to the 5% is really significant. 2.5 times the amount, which again, I don't view it as a negative thing, but I also don't want to feel like we're land grabbing.
We could reduce the percentage.
And I like the idea of including a percentage because it's possible that we have development that just has really big lots. And if it's percentage based, then it doesn't negatively impact what we're trying to do here.
Scott,
Coming into this meeting,
any advice? Go ahead. Sorry.
Councilor. Coming into this meeting, I was leaning towards the parks plan, but now I am feeling more supportive of option 2. So that's just my input. So thank you very much.
I'll just add that selecting one or the other, we're getting to a point here as Elizabeth said, this is work session 3 of 3. And so it may be that we're getting ready to do public notice. We just issued the required notice this to the Land Conservation and Development for the comprehensive plan. And so that hearings for the comprehensive plan document are underway, and we're trying to wrap up a hearings ready draft for the development code as well. So it would be best to have one or the other here if I'm kind of hearing more towards the Sherwood example, instead of showing 2 where it's sort of a moving target. Once we get into the public hearing level, it's more of the public's turn to respond to what we have in a draft stage.
Is from your experience with other cities, have you seen more or less of either of these options, or?
Haven't seen it too much. It's out there. Working for the city of Dallas, had a standard there. I think I shared that with the council in a previous work session, a standard that didn't work very well, and they got rid of it in favor of larger parks that we will not create through this. There, if that's desirable to do, I don't want to influence a decision based on another, what another city has done and found that it doesn't work. That especially a city that didn't have the money for funding it. That's one of the things that the more parks that you have, and if it goes into, if it's dedicated to the public, it has to be funded, and that goes into what Shannon has to do when preparing a budget to allocate the money for that. But there have been some homeowners associations that have been created through subdivisions. The homeowners associations will fall apart in time, especially the smaller the subdivision. Or they say this is our private park area, it's not for the public. If it is in a homeowners association, or if it just kind of falls apart, especially if it's it's an active open space. If it's passive, it's more of if the maintenance, or if it's a natural area, maybe it maintains itself.
We need to make a decision. I'm sorry.
Well, just some of those
Excuse me, but
items,
We
Shannon,
need to make the decision.
is part of it. That Gordon brought up, stormwater, I mean, there's, you know, street medians, you know, all sorts of things that don't incorporate Quota Park. They're green.
But are great, yeah.
Suggestions? Decisions?
I'm leaning towards 2 right now.
Too.
Option 2 from Sherwood? Okay,
It seems to give us our most square footage.
okay. We'll go with the Sherwood model.
All right, thank you. We can refine this with some more specifics, just to make it integrate with the code better based on that direction. Thanks. Make sure we exempt those stormwater facilities, for example. The most egregious example I've ever seen is a developer claimed that their stormwater pond was going to host like motorized boat races, like remote controlled yachts. And so it was really active recreation space.
Okay, so that'll work.
That's the creativity, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Since we've had a sample come through, that's not egregious.
Be part of fun days. Like they do.
Yeah, there we go.
RC boat race.
So where are we going now, Steve?
All
We
right.
have, yep, Elizabeth's going to present some of the topics that we've touched on previously that you might want to visit again in March when Scott will lead the work session. Take it away, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so like Steve said, we've just had our 3 work sessions. We've, you know, given each division some time and attention through discussion. But, you know, just like with this park, some of these we had more clear direction in our previous work sessions than others. And so I compiled this list of the issues that were more substantial that we talked about as a way for council to sort of review where we've been and if there are any of these in particular that you would like to highlight and direct staff to be prepared to discuss in March. You know, for any additional, you know, reconsideration, could just be more information, could be further direction or refinement. But what would help you get ready for the adoption process? So I can read these.
Is that in our packet here?
Yeah, so this was just a request that I received today. So it is not in your packet. I
okay.
forwarded it to the city and you know, I'm sure we can talk about making it available to you, but it just rehashes sort of those, you know, what I termed the key issues in each of these 3 memos. So things like allowing this variety of residential uses, with the different types of uses that are being proposed to be introduced. If you go back to that, you know, duplexes, townhouses, cottage clusters, some changes to how townhouses are permitted. We talked about, you know, not needing site design review for if it's just 2, increasing minimum density in the R3 zone, providing, we were just talking about lot sizes, you know, the only lot size reduction proposed with these updates is for that higher density multifamily zone to allow a 3,000 square foot minimum lot size, more consistent with the maximum density already permitted. Then, you know, also residential related for new subdivisions, a lot of the pieces that we talked about tonight, the lot size averaging, this, you know, housing variety with over 28 homes, the tree pieces, the enhanced open space requirements. We talked about some different details of cottage cluster developments, had some good conversations there about the cluster size and adding in that housing variety when there's more than one cluster, as will include the sizes of cottages, some site perimeter setbacks. We've talked through some vacation rental issues, some minimum heights in a portion of the downtown. We talked about commercial lodging options in the commercial zones, the street tree planting requirements, native species, invasive species, like we talked about last month, Pedestrian access ways also came up last month, and any other mid-block connections. So that's the list that I've compiled of the more substantive, beyond the sort of refinement issues and clarification questions. So any that jump out to you all that you'd really like to direct staff to be prepared to discuss next month?
Yes.
I think you've spoken well to it, and I apologize. There's a reason I didn't go to school to be a planner, but I want to make sure I'm clear on the lot size averaging and the minimum lot sizing in each zone. Again, out of fear for one type or of another of a whole development becoming uniform and just the same, or I think
Yeah.
that's enough said, but I would like to make sure I feel good about it, but I just feel like there was stuff talked about in the past about allowing it in all zones, reducing the lot sizes and throughout every zone. So I just still feel like there's a little bit in the air for me on that.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
So is that the only subject you want us to be prepared to talk about in March?
We could,
Read that.
yeah, we could
I'd like-
kick in,
Yeah,
Sorry.
we could kick in this end discussion too. This last one we just had about the,
we're looking for
Parts.
feedback tonight so that we can prepare adequately for the March meeting.
yeah,
I think there's general consensus on that last topic, but again, there's still some uneasiness. I mean, I think you can understand how difficult it is to sit in front of some of these complex and hard topics and try to feel like, let's go. And then a year or two down the road, we're gonna suffer the repercussions of it because
Shannon, am I understanding you correctly that we need to decide on all of this tonight, whether we need further discussion?
What we'd like to hear from you is what do you need to hear in March in order to feel comfortable moving forward through the adoption process? So are there topic areas such as Council President Skipper has just mentioned about more discussion, understanding about lot size averaging in my zone? That's what he needs in order to be able to move comfortably into the adoption process.
I'd like to hear more about the planting, the native species of trees, getting rid of the non-native, which type of trees. Have a list of where other towns that have done certain things, so we know, more and more what trees we should be putting in, what bushes, what's gonna work within the town on the planning part of it.
So you're looking for more of an understanding of natives versus non-natives, or?
Native, non-native, which ones are gonna be best for our area for the, longevity of them.
And what are we considering to be a native tree? Because native to Oregon, native to
Right.
the valley.
Might be native to,
we did
say,
have that
Carlton,
discussion.
200-mile radius.
I know this was discussed too. Maybe a little bit more on the commercial lodging, including hotels and motels and commercial zones. I know we spoke to that a little bit, and I remember looking at a map and kind of envisioning that. So maybe just clarifying that a little bit more of what the code will allow and where.
we good? We're getting kind of toward the end of our time here. So,
Scott, do you feel like you have what you need in order to do some research and bring forth material for March?
Yeah, so, I think pretty good meeting here for feedback and got some direction there. So, this will be the March 5th meeting and a final work session, so we have workshop. That's another one of the, I can kind of read the list here quickly, but it's a lot size averaging, kind of how that works by the zone, because maybe I could dig up an example of that where it's worked out in another city. It is something that other cities have put together. Also tree planting, non-native, I think that we had a list that was generated for that purpose, if I'm not mistaken. So we have some examples that we can put together, and then commercial lodging with, so that's a fairly easy one. I think where that would be allowed, go back to that map display as well. So not too bad. And we will start the hearing. The notice though would be out on March 4th. So we will post a document online that's the hearing document, but these are easy things to get more clarification on. I think that's doable.
In the hearing document, it will go first to the planning commission. That is the hearing document that's referring to. Then we'll start with the comp plan and then comp plan. And then the planning commission is here the developers. And then
Thank you. Do I have a motion to adjourn this meeting?
Motion to adjourn the work session.
All in second, all in favor?
Aye.
All righty,
thank you, Steve. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
thank you.
Good evening.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you for all your hard work. That's, I'm glad it was you and not me doing. Sorry. We need to take, we're gonna be late, but do we need to, anybody need to take it? So, we need to take some,
You get to make this.
pardon?
It's your meeting.
I never know what is of concern and what is, we can go ahead and fudge it a little bit. So I always worry about that. But yeah, if somebody needs to stretch their legs and take a break, that might be a good time to do it.
2 minutes.
You betcha. Go for it.
Sounds good.
Okay,
What's this?
to order. We are opening the Tuesday, February 6, 2024 regular session of the Carlton City Council. Could you call the roll call, please?
Counselor David Stephen
Here.
Counselor Carolyn Thompson Riser.
Here.
Counselor Grant Erickson.
Here.
Counselor Jeremy Brandel.
Here.
Counselor Shirley Ward Mullen.
Here.
Council President Kevin Skipper.
Here.
And Mayor Linda Watkins.
Here,
All counselors present.
thank you. Would you please join with me in giving the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. Thank you. All righty, are there any changes or additions to the agenda?
There are 3 small items to end to the bottom of the agenda.
Alrighty, so we just will know that those are there. Plus 3, if I don't do that, I'll forget. Alrighty, ceremonies, appointments, announcements. Anything going on? Okay. Citizen comments. This is the section of the agenda that allows members of the public to address the city council on any items that are off or on the agenda. When invited by the mayor, members of the public shall come forward, state your name and street address, and direct all comments to the mayor. Comments are typically limited to 3 minutes unless additional time is allowed by the mayor. we start with items that are not on our tonight's agenda. Is there anybody out there that would like to speak to anything?
I see no hands raised at this time.
Thank you. In that case, we move on to item B, which is items that are on the agenda. Is there anybody out there that has any comments?
I see no hands raised at this time.
Thank you, ma'am. In that case, we will move on to the consent agenda. Are there any, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I move to approve the consent agenda.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, item 8, ordinances, resolutions, discussions, and action items. Item A is Market Street sanitary line change order.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor and City Council, this is a change order related to sanitary line that is connected to the Civic Center and also the 3 properties surrounding. And to give more details, I'm actually going to turn it over to Gordon Monroe at this time.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thumbs up if you can. Okay, good. I always like to check. Okay, so during the design, when Holst was doing the design of the Civic building, we knew that the old City Hall had a sanitary service line that went out to East Main. What we didn't know is that that was not just a service line, it was actually a main line that was not on the city maps and we were not aware of, that kept going north and actually served the dentist office, a home back there, and the duplex that's just north of the city property. And we found out that that line was in poor condition, had bellies in it, so it wasn't working very well. And we had to do some investigation to find out exactly where the line was. Ends up, it sits almost directly below the foundation of the new police building garage. And then it would keep heading south and would be underneath the new Civic building. So that is not a good thing. It would mean even if we fixed it, that line would be inaccessible in the future if any O&M was required on that line. It's never a good thing to have a sanitary sewer main underneath 2 buildings. So as part of the design of the Civic building, we kept the service line for the new Civic building going out to East Main, and then redesigned the sewer main that serves the dentist office, the home, and the duplex. Turned that east, it goes down their driveway and then continues east on Market Street all the way to 2nd. And so that's about 344 feet of new sewer main headed east, tying into the existing system. We had to get easements on all 3 properties to do this work. And there was, at the time, 2 of the properties were in transition, so that took a while to get, but we finally got the design and we have a change order fee from Haworth of $82,807.55, which is less than what we had estimated. If we had put this out to bid, we were estimating that it would be about $130,000. So the price that Haworth has given us is a very good price. And I think part of that is because they're already on site, they've already mobilized. So that is the change order. And if anybody has questions concerning that, I'd be happy to respond.
Are there any questions?
Hi, Gordon. You probably answered my question by saying that Haworth, they've come in with a much less lower price than what you anticipated went out for bid. So that is why we should be approving this as part of the City Hall project when the service is going to be including more than the City Hall, because at the end it's less cost for us.
It's part of the City Hall project because the sewer had to be changed and realigned because of the civic building project. If that project hadn't occurred, we didn't have a reason to move this. But now that it's occurred, we don't want the sewer line underneath the civic building. That's why it got included with the civic building.
Of course, then you found out that it wasn't really functioning properly either.
Council
Right,
President?
yeah, we then subsequently found out other issues.
Part of those other issues, I get that it says it's old and needs maintenance. Is this, what type of material is the existing line?
That's one of the unknowns. But we do know that it has bellies in it, so it doesn't flow correctly. The belly is just what you think it is, where the pipe dips below the grade line, so it can't flow by gravity until a lot of water piles up in the pipe. If a belly's big enough, you get a lot of solids deposits there, and it further blocks the line, so you have a continual O&M issue. And when they went down, they looked down through some cleanouts, or we looked down through some cleanouts into the pipe, and did some exploration. If I remember right, I think it was a clay line.
Thank you.
Which is never good either.
And this
Test to that.
old line that's being abandoned, is it just being capped off and allowed to remain, or what's the end result of the old line?
We're going to fill it with grout.
Okay.
So it'll be essentially like solid ground underneath there. So it won't cause a problem to the new building or to the police garage.
So I have a hypothetical question. So if City Hall wasn't being built, that wasn't a factor, but this line failed and it had to be replaced, would it be that at the expense of the city to replace that, or would any of these other entities have some responsibility?
It'd be at the expense of the city.
Okay. Thank
That's
you.
The main line.
Did Shannon answer that?
Yes, she did. Thank you.
Okay.
So we need a motion.
It is moved that City Council accept change order number 5 and authorize the mayor to execute all necessary documents.
Is there a second?
Seconded.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Thanks,
So
Gordon.
as a matter of process, I'll now send this to the contractor to sign, and as soon as he signs it, we'll get it to the mayor to sign.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.
Okay, item B, CIS Park Risk Assessment Review.
Yes, Mayor and Council, as part of our continuing discussion on the changes in recreational immunity, we had our parks assessed, and I would like to introduce Margaret Ryan with CIS to discuss her report and her recommendations. Thank you for
Good
joining.
evening. You're welcome. Good evening, councilors, mayor, city staff, and community. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me. Earlier this year, there was a case in Newport that changed how recreational immunity is being handled. And the case was won at first, and then it went to appeal, and the city lost. And they lost because the appellate court found that the intent of the user was walking on a path to the beach, and they said the intent of the user needs to be considered versus what we would believe just the use of a path to a beach is. So with that change, they looked for that case. They sent it to the Supreme Court and asked for a review. The Supreme Court turned that down. So because of that, we are now recommending changes to the way entities handle their recreational areas, because this is a really vulnerable area for us right now. So I did come out and I walked with your city manager and your planner and attorney to different sites, and we evaluated them. We evaluated them based on a couple different things. One is the use of the site. One is what the city has for resources to maintain that site. And then I sent a report with recommendations for the different sites. And there's a couple ways to look at this. One is we are hoping for a legislative fix that will, the legislature has generally supported recreational immunity. So we do hear there is one pending for the short session in 24, and then hopefully something more thorough in 25. But until then, paths and walkways it's a vulnerable place. And the most conservative approach is to close them to authorized use. The next step behind that, a little less aggressive, is to just evaluate them and close the ones that you just can't make safe. So should I talk about, do you have questions? Do you want me to talk about the report?
What's your preference, folks? Would you like to discuss the report or just start asking questions?
What do we close?
Nothing.
Pardon?
What is she saying? What do we need to close? What is her?
Why don't you just go through them? That probably might be.
I'll go down the report. I'm going to move a little quickly down them and slow me down if I need to. So Wennerberg Park, the issue with that is it's in a condition. You have recreational immunity still for the primary, like beach or park. We haven't necessarily lost it for those primary area, but that's a park that's in worn condition. And you recreational immunity, if you don't deal with hazards, then you might not have the recreational immunity in there. I'm trying to think of the word. It's escaped me, but you want to make sure if there are hazards, and that park has a lot of trees that are look like they could use some attention. That is, it floods and then dries out, so that isn't easy on the tree roots. So there are hazards at that park. So I suggested, since part of it is closed, I think is it the back part is closed, I suggested signs warning of hazards and saying use this park at your own risk. Not just because of the loss of trail path recreational immunity, but because of the condition of that park. So that's the first one. Does anybody want to talk about that at all? Oh, the term is gross negligence. So that's where, and that would be interpreted by a court, but if a tree were to fall on somebody, that's where, even though there is recreational immunity still for that primary recreating area, you have to not, you can't be grossly negligent. So, and that would be determined by a court. Okay, if there are no questions, I'll move to Ladd Park, Upper City Park. So one of the interesting things about this one is this is kind of like the Newport Fields versus Newport. This is an area that people use not just to recreate, but to kind of cross through town, a little transportation corridor. So it is one where those paths would fall very much in line with the Fields case. So this one I recommended some signs, some maintenance, just really keeping that the paths clear, removing any trip hazards, really staying on your maintenance. It's a well-maintained park, but just because it goes from different areas and different surfaces, were some trip hazards. So I suggested some signs and some kind of cleanup maintenance for that. Any questions on Ladd Park?
No.
Okay. It's a beautiful park on a side note. Okay, I'm over on Han Creek Park.
Question, did you also recommend a railing over by that drop off where there's that? help
The
me out.
cement block, the parking lot, the
Oh,
parking
Um,
area
Is
on-
it?
Yes, thank
On
you.
Grant Street.
on Grant Street. Yeah, the retaining wall.
Oh, I actually just suggested signs for that saying use our paths.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I think in general, you have a great path. Directing people with a sign is a great idea just for maintenance purposes, for tripping hazards, for any of that. So the next one is Han Creek Park, and you can rest easy. That one it is straightforward. I didn't recommend anything other than the wonderful maintenance that's being done on it right now. It's in great condition. And then JR1 Park. So it's a small little, I think I just heard you guys calling them a pocket park. I just recommended continued maintenance on that. And then JR2 Park. So JR2 Park is nothing but a travel path, trail. That's the vulnerable area right now. It's an area that has some asphalt, some gravel, some ups and downs back and forth. It opens up kind of over by the wetlands that's kind of receding there. And I suggested you put signs in that say use is not authorized. Use it at your own risk. Because there might be a legislative fix soon, you could put temporary signs up. We also, with the articles that I've sent your way, or I can send them if you haven't seen them, we've recommended verbiage for your websites or for your recreational flyers that explains recreational immunity. So when people see a sign that says this isn't authorized for use, your city doesn't just get a bunch of phone calls, but there is some media that says this is why we're doing this. So we don't recommend barricades or no tripping hazards. We don't want that. But telling people that this is not city maintained. And it's not city maintained. The city doesn't have the resources to go through and add gravel back in and fill holes when water gets, starts making little divots in there. So I recommended putting a sign up that said it's not authorized for use. Use it at your own risk, because that one I think looks vulnerable to me. And that's it. That's the last one.
Does anybody have any questions?
No. Seems reasonable.
With that, staff will go forward and implement this signage. We did receive a grant. We will probably be putting multiple signs in these locations.
So on the Winterberg Park, there's signs of, the construction stuff, just park that, what, or pictures. I don't see anything on the trail that goes to the river. Or is that outside of the city?
No, that was part of what we drove on to evaluate the park, Lower Park. And that, I believe that's included in your signage of closing during flooding and for making sure that people understand it's not maintained by the cities, particularly in the winter time.
Correct. And I took a lot of pictures and only put some in the report, but yes, that is.
Yeah,
congratulations on your grant. I think at CIS, we're really appreciative that members are being as proactive as you are. And the day that I was out inspecting, Tyler, your attorney, said, what about having some like an ordinance? And I said, oh, we don't think that's going to help right now. Since then, we've changed the recommendation to include that. So Tyler was a little ahead of the curve on that. But I feel like you're really protecting yourselves in some wonderful ways. And I'm glad the grant is going to help with a little bit of that, because these can be big lawsuits. So you're really taking great proactive steps.
And that ordinance is on your agenda later tonight.
See that, I saw it.
There's one comment you made I'm curious about, because I know that every year Public Works puts a lot of money into trimming and pruning and evaluating the trees in the lower park. So they do a lot of maintenance work, I think, on that. I'm not saying that they get everything, but I just wanted to make that point too, that they do spend a lot of time out there working and trying to maintain and be assured that they're pulling out dangerous areas.
Yeah, it's that balance, I think, that Margaret's talking about, because yes, we do we have an arborist come in every spring, and yet we saw some of the size of the branches that came down this year.
And it
so-
happens, yeah.
And oaks have a tendency to rot from the center. And
I'm just speaking out in defense of our Public Works guys. They put a lot of work into that park, so.
You know, I would agree with you. Your sites are very well maintained. It's really, and I actually suggested that I go back in the spring to do a better look at it and a better look at the playground to maybe make some other safety, moving
little
away from
different,
recreational
yeah.
community. But they are doing an excellent job. It's a bit the age, it's the site and the location and the water. I agree with you though. The maintenance was excellent.
So we are just talking about signage at this point, just to be clear,
Signage, cleanup.
not closing.
But for JR2, the signage it's unauthorized use. This is not.
Closed, use at your own risk
Yes.
covers that. Not unauthorized means to me like you could be penalized for using it.
So one of the things we have in the first article that was written on this, and I can send it again, is it explains that we are the city is not authorizing you to use it, and we're expecting you to follow the rules. And we don't necessarily have staffing to enforce the rules, but we're telling you you're not supposed to use this. And the point of that would be, again, to use as a defense if somebody were to be using that fall and then say, I hurt myself and it's your fault, then your verbiage said, well, we told you not to use it in the first place. We aren't, so that by closing it, that's what we're saying. You're closing it to authorized use. And the verbiage that we have, which you could kind of put on a website it's a little bit longer, but it explains what that means, that we don't have staffing to enforce it. We're telling you, you're not allowed to use it. And that's our warning to you.
Yeah.
So basically, to translate this into the simplest terms possible, we're not permitting you to use it, so therefore we're not liable if you do use it.
Well, we don't want to be liable, but people can and still will file claims. But it's just like the ordinance that we just suggested. Then we have some defenses. So it's not the immunity part. The immunity, the gift of that is that it stops that lawsuit right up front. Right now, because we've lost the recreational immunity on paths and trails, it has to go all the way to trial. So that case has to be fought. So it's just a defense. It's just another thing that another tool we can use to say, you know, we told them we don't have the maintenance for this. It's not safe. We listed hazards if you have hazards to list. It's just something else to use to defend that claim or that lawsuit.
Did you make the comment regarding Winterberg Park that the playground facility on the north side, the older one, was that there were a lot of hazards? I think I recall reading that.
Yes.
Keeping that, Shannon, since we have the new playground facility.
I think Margaret asked the same
Because,
question.
because you will have a revolution if you try to take it out.
It is highly used, especially by.
It's
kids.
heavily
But
used.
it's unsafe.
So we didn't actually do a playground inspection of that playground. We talked about going back and doing that in the spring. So it just looked to me like there are some safety things, like you want to have enough surfacing underneath. So it looked to me from just a light visual of it like it had safety concerns, and that's something we should go back and look at. We did spend the day really focused on the recreational immunity piece with paths and trails, and I suggested we go back and talk in detail about what we could do to make that safer in the spring.
And maybe the hope is, I don't know when the short session is.
Started on Monday.
Maybe in the spring, this is a non-issue. That's kind of what everybody's hoping.
Well, what I've heard is it's not a permanent, it's not a perfect fix, but it's something. And I don't know what that means. There is a better fix planned for 25. So it's a bit of a Band-Aid fix.
Are there any other questions? And I think that was basically informational.
Informational, but staff, now that you've heard it, will take action and start implementing signage.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Appreciate the
Thank you.
time.
Good
With
night.
that, if I may, with that signage, like with the wording she said, explaining. So we don't just see signs going up and then everybody going. Like how,
Yeah,
are
I
we
got a
prepared to
call-
kind of
yeah.
get ahead of that with some of the, we can't staff it?
And I think it's worth putting it on the website too. Why are we having
Yeah.
a sign?
We'll have to refer a lot of people to the website, even from the signage. There is only so much you can get on a
Good.
sign
Yeah.
for people either stop reading or it's this tiny.
Right, I'm just thinking in the newsletter and things like that, like,
And we've already
More
started
of a
people
virtual.
calling, giving them that exact information, putting it onto the website. We're gonna be putting it into the newsletter. Well, we recognize it'll take more than once.
oh yeah.
And can I just add, we're also suggesting in all of your messaging to have people contact their legislators, because everyone that chimes in on this and says this is not how we want this to be done only helps the cause.
Good point.
Mhm.
Put it on the website.
We'll get on it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Item C, Cycle Yamhill County. We have a guest this evening, I take it.
Yes, Casey Kula is joining us to speak about this topic. Thank you for joining us, Casey.
Yeah, thank you. First, Shannon,
Yes.
if I could get sharing privileges, I can put up a presentation.
Good to go with sharing.
You should be okay, Casey.
Oh my gosh, I didn't even try because figured the city council would lock me out. Let's hang on a second. Can you see it?
It's loading. It says it's loading.
I have very fast internet, so I got it up fast, but we're still waiting for you. Sorry. While we're chit-chatting though, the new space looks amazing. I'm really excited to greet all of you in it. For the record, I'm Casey Kula. I used to be a Yamhill County Commissioner, and now I just do bike stuff all day. Actually, not all day. And with me is
Philip Higgins. So I'm Vice President of Cycle Yamhill County, which is a 501c3, and obviously Casey is also a member of that particular organization, and he sits on our board as the secretary.
Actually, I'm the treasurer.
Oh, treasurer. Sorry, that's right. Adam's secretary. So I will blame that misspoken on my Yamhill Carlton education. I was class of 1986, so I grew up here. I'm local and excited to be presenting to the council here in Carlton. So.
And I apologize that this is going so slowly. You can't see it, can you?
I
It still says loading on my
briefly, and
end.
then it went away.
I do have a copy of it. I can share it on my screen if you'd like. You can just have me advance slides.
Casey, would that work if she tries to bring it up on the screen and have you just tell her to advance slides?
It would totally work, except there's one slide that the formatting looks terrible, and I feel bad about that.
We'll survive.
Okay. So yes, I'm gonna stop share. And thank you all for again inviting us and sitting through. We're going to try to have a relatively short presentation because you all have had a big day already, and my kids are texting me about where I am right now, which is just that I'm in an outbuilding on the farm. Oh no, we've got the spinning circle of life. Well, let's get started anyway. So we have a very full agenda for you here, which is really to tell you about the proposed Panther Creek mountain bike trail network. And Philip and I will tag team that. And we have what we really want to hear from you is questions and comments, but we have a specific format for doing that so that we don't keep you here all night and keep us here all night, and my kids will wonder where I am. And eventually we'll get to that slide. Oh wait, can you forward slides now?
Yes.
All right, next slide, please.
Did it work?
I can see them on the sidebar. We could just go with that.
Okay, there we got it. There we got it.
Fantastic. Let's go to number 3, though. Wonderful. So what we have here is a QR code, and there'll be one at the very end too, and then you'll have it in the packet. So if you want to ask a question or send a comment in or say, hey, I want to help or I want to see the site, just go there and submit your comments or your questions. I'm happy to also take questions here. We are happy, but you've had a long night and you still have other things you need to do. So next slide, please. So Cycle Yamhill County has been working with Visit McMinnville, Travel Oregon, the Bureau of Land Management, and C2 Consulting, which is just a really wonderful recreation planner, on a destination mountain biking trail network. So next slide, please. Yes. So starting several years ago, Philip and I and a couple of other people, including the Bureau of Land Management, got together and started talking about what we could do. Thank you, that's perfect. What we could do to bring more trails to the area. We are now in a specific public engagement process working with the Bureau of Land Management, and we expect that to be substantially complete by spring of 2024. That's this spring, just in case you're forgetting that it's 2024. So some of the key stakeholders were local cyclists from the area who we want to have feel really comfortable here, tribal managers, city and county administrators and elected officials, neighboring forest landowners, and coastal range residents in general. And it's our intent with this project to continuously engage with the community. In my current day job, I work a lot with adaptive management, which is when you use science to inform your practices and then change your practices based upon what you see. And that's really kind of what we're planning to do here, is continuous engagement with the community. Next slide, please. All right. So to set the scene, though, before we get into the project and where it is, I just want to kind of dial back a little bit and note that there are over 60 tribes and bands of indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest who've lived here since time immemorial. Some of them have been exterminated. Most and many of them are still with us today. And despite the treaties and terminations and restorations and other barriers, there are 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon, what we call Oregon today, and other federally recognized tribes outside of Oregon have interests in the state. And there are still others who are working towards federal recognition. And today, throughout those original territories, tribes play active roles in their regions, their counties, and their communities, using that extensive knowledge and the history of the place. And in Oregon, outdoor recreation occurs on those ancestral lands. And we have a responsibility at Cycle Yamhill County to seek out the history of the places and the people and to engage with the current caretakers and future caretakers of that land. And to that end, we have reached out and are reaching out to Grand Ronde, Warm Springs, and Siletz tribes for both informal and formal consultation. And I recognize that there are also members of other tribes and bands who have connections to the place that we're never going to know. So with that, we'll go to the next slide, which is our project overview. And we can actually go right to the next one. Look at how fast we're going through this presentation. Okay, so Philip, can you describe to us what's that red dot?
Yeah, so that red dot is probably epicenter. Those of you who are local here may have heard Ball Bearing Hill mentioned, but Ball Bearing Hill is sort of the uppermost part of Vaughn Road, which is a connector road right off of Panther Creek Road, which again flows from Meadow Lake Road and then off into Carlton. The initial parking lot staging area, I believe we timed it as 12 minutes from the Carlton Bakery. So, you know, as a cyclist who frequently rides out of Carlton, the Carlton Bakery is a significant wayfinding point to all calorie-powered sport. So next slide, please.
Yeah, next slide, please.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, I think I need to move this over a little bit. So you can sort of to the northeast corner of the slide there, you can see where Panther Creek comes up, and then it turns into Vaughn Road where the little dots are here, and obviously Vaughn Road is outlined. These two yellow squares are actually sections that are owned and managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And the Bureau of Land Management has two essential charges from the government, which is timber management, i.e., you know, logging, growing trees and logging trees. And then also a little lesser known mandate from the federal government, which is outdoor recreation. And so they have reached out to us to actually help facilitate their outdoor recreation plans for this area. All of the white squigglies you see there are trails that have been outlined by C2 Consulting. There's approximately 26 miles of trails that'll be built out in probably 3 phases. We are entering into an agreement with the Bureau of Land Management for a right-of-way lease, a 20-foot right-of-way lease that would encompass all those trails. So we won't actively own the trails, but we will build, manage, and maintain those. Casey?
I think that's next slide, please.
Okay.
Which is also Philip.
Yes. So this slide right here sort of gets to the meat of what it is. So Cycle Yamhill County, ostensibly, we are an economic development organization, and we're centered around outdoor recreation. So outdoor recreation is a $16.4 billion economic impact to the state of Oregon. It represents 2.5% of our GDP. That is broken down into 2 sort of specific buckets. About 1% of that 2.4% is direct spending on the thing itself, right? The actual activity. The 1.4% is indirect spending that's related to the pursuit of the activity, and those would be things like stays in hotels, dining in local restaurants, buying groceries, you know, shopping, you know, all the sort of ancillary things that one does when one goes on vacation. So that actually in the state of Oregon as of 2022 fuels 224,000 full and part-time jobs and equates to $9.3 billion in wage compensation for people. So outdoor recreation is literally and figuratively massive, massive business. One of the nice things about outdoor recreation is that it is really low hanging fruit when it comes to the cost benefit return that you're looking at as a community. You can invest very, very small dollar numbers and see an outsized return for those investments. So, for example, with the Panther Creek Mountain Bike Trail system, we're projected to spend about $2 million all in to build out these 26 miles of trails. You can see by 2035 at full capacity, with about 125,000 visitors a year, that kicks off about $7.5 million in economic benefit to the local area. So now, will all of that go to Carlton Bakery? Probably not. But
Only half.
yeah, a good share of it will certainly filter through Carlton. Also, make its way into Yamhill. And full disclaimer, I'm on the board of the Yamhill Downtown Association. This site is also 24 minutes from Tommy's Bike Shop in McMinnville. So I mean, it's a very accessible place for most all of Yamhill County. For the folks who live here, and then will be a significant draw for folks who are willing to travel and ride. So the two real things to focus on are when you are competing for employment opportunities and somebody's looking at moving to Bend because Bend has outdoor recreation and Yamhill County does not. All of a sudden, we're leveling the playing field to a degree by being able to offer significant quality of life increases to, talented employees. And then of course we have the visitor impacts, which we're all, much more familiar with from, wine industry tourism here. And so what it is we're giving people different reasons to come here. Different socioeconomic demographics will actually come here, and the same ones that are already visiting here may, make their stays longer and generate more revenue for the community. So there you go. Next slide.
Awesome. Thanks, Philip. Next slide, please. So existing conditions on the site, and we can go, this is actually photos from a bike ride that we did with a wonderful fellow, Will Cortez, at Metro Parks and Metro Parks and Nature. And he, like you, is grappling with the recreational immunity laws, handling a lot of facilities for Metro. And I'm at the Capitol doing the same thing. So let's talk some more about this. Next slide, please. So as Philip noted, Yamhill County currently has limited outdoor recreation facilities and trails. And you probably know that because your parks are so heavily used. Getting to the river is very difficult, though we have a lot of riverfront in our community. Very little of it is public and has access. We have a lot of public land in the Coast Range that's either inaccessible because it's behind a gate or it doesn't have trails on it. So it's only for the intrepid folks. It's important to note that any development that's going to be done here is going to be done in a way that respects and preserves the area's natural and historical significance. That's required by the BLM, and that's what we'll have to do. The current state of Ball Bearing Hill and the BLM land that's managed on our behalf, all of our behalf, is dominated by forest land, managed for timber and for habitat and for drinking water, because Panther Creek flows, as you know, into your reservoir. The backside of Ball Bearing Hill actually flows into the Nestucca River watershed that goes into the Pacific Ocean, and the south side of Ball Bearing Hill, southeast, flows into Baker Creek, which also flows into the North Yamhill. Next slide, please. Philip, back to you.
So one of the challenges of being sort of a cycling specific economic development organization is that we don't actually have, as we have mentioned, a lot of trails in the particular region. We are also not a terribly road cycling friendly place because Yamhill County lacks shoulders on all the roads. In fact, I believe the only county bike lane is over by Laughlin Trucking, basically at the new split that goes off to the Abbey, and that's probably 150 feet long. So there's a lot of work to do. So we have a scarcity of public lands with trailheads and welcoming access. We also have hundreds and hundreds of miles of BLM and private timberlands. So in the absence of sort of bike focused trails, trails for dog walkers, families, and things like that, people are forced into sometimes contentious requests for trails, as we've all seen play out. And we want to sort of, I guess, allow people to experience trails and experience nature in all their glory in safe spaces that are obviously not contested for access. So let's see, complementing the existing network, let me transition here. So there are an array of bike focused trails networks here in Oregon that are outside of our area that draw people from all over the world for ridership. Actually, BLM is the actually owner of the Sandy Ridge Trail Network, which started out much like Panther Creek will, which was, you know, local people coming together, building the trails. Once it got to be a size that the BLM felt that they could take over the management, they took over the management and now run the show. So, you know, for us, our mission is to provide a variety of experiences for people, regardless of, you know, ability or disability or age or gender. We're looking at, you know, sort of the topography of this area. And I don't know how many of you have spent any time out in that neck of the woods, literally and figuratively, but Vaughn Road is very steep, tops out at about 2,400 feet at the top of Ball Bearing Hill, but the lower slopes, right where you enter Vaughn Road off Panther Creek, the terrain is much kinder. And so we have facilities there that will be geared towards, you know, beginner cyclists, you know, parents with kids. There'll be areas, picnic areas where people can actually come and like experience walking trails and go down and tour Panther Creek itself. The higher up you go on the mountain, the more technical the terrain will be and the more appealing to people who are proficient and maybe hardcore mountain bikers. So.
Awesome. So next slide, please. This is the one that's looks so terrible. But we will focus on really, so planning has been going on since January 2023, and it will finish up in June of 2024. That's this June. Design, again, it'll finish up in June of 2024 as we tweak things in response to comments from the public and from the Bureau of Land Management. The goal is to have construction of phase 1 begin in October of 2024. That's this year, through May of 2025. And that's really getting our ducks in a row in the fall to be ready for construction season in the spring. And then phases 2 and 3 will happen after that, then the following years. It's really important for us to have a sustainable build out. And it frankly, it takes a lot of time to move every limb off of the land for 25 miles of a 20-foot wide corridor, which will be 6 feet of riding and walking, with a grand opening planned in June of 2025. Next slide, please.
I was gonna say, one of the things I'm gonna interject here too is one of the reasons that we had discussed about the phasing of it, you know, as opposed to just going in there and you know, knocking out 25 miles of trails, is that, you know, we need to also help build our volunteer network of people who maintain these trails. So, you know, 25 miles of trails is a lot of maintenance, especially, you know, obviously you could see how many trees and limbs came down during the ice storm in just the local parks. So you try to sort of mentally transfer that up into, you know, the wilds of Panther Creek mountain bike area. That's a lot of cleanup. And so, you know, part of it for us is capacity building around, you know, building miles into the asset and having the capacity to maintain those miles that get built.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we, our next step after doing extensive public engagement is to pull all that engagement together and do thorough review and then substantive responses. So real comments and real responses in return. So that's things like if we need to do a further analysis, we'll do a further analysis. That'll essentially be completed and ready to go by the end of next month. Woo! We're moving. So in June of 2024, we will submit to the BLM our environmental assessment and those responses to community comments, and that'll be all a public record. The goal is that by this fall, we'll assign a lease agreement with the BLM and we'll seek construction funding for phase 1. We can seek the construction funding, though we won't have the authority to build on the site because BLM is a partner for us. We won't be building until we have the signed lease agreement. In winter 24-25 is when we'll construct and maintain phase 1, and we'll seek input and address concerns as we look to phases 2 and 3. And Philip said, hey, have you ever been to the site? If you've never been to the site, next slide, please.
Here is an opportunity to visit it firsthand.
So Sunday, February 25th from 10 a.m. to noon. It's just because I like to get things done. No like dilly-dallying down in the drainages. It is clean up on Ball Bearing Hill. Join us at the bridge on Vaughn Road. So that's where you go you go Meadow Lake, Panther Creek, Vaughn Road. There's a great little spot. We'll start there with garbage bags and trailers, and we'll pick up mostly shells, honestly, shells and garbage on the way up to Ball Bearing Hill, and then we'll have lunch there. Next slide, please. Final slide.
I want to know if he's buying.
Thank you. And so we have the QR code again. Feel free to subscribe. You can go on to cyclinghillcounty.com. We have a monthly newsletter for what Cycling in Hill County has been doing, kind of broadly. And then we've got one that's specific to our future trail stewards, so the folks who are going to be taking care of the trails, called the Dirt Cup. And with that, Philip.
I was going to say, I'd also, one more plug too for going to Cycle Yamhill County, the projects tab that will be at the top of the page. If you click on that, it will have 2 projects, one of which is the Panther Creek mountain bike area, and then the other, which was recently funded with a $65,000 grant from Travel Oregon, is the Yamhill County Gravel Trail Network. And so please take a look at that and see. We'll be working later this summer to put up signs with the help of Yamhill County Public Works, outlining basically some of the gravel roads and providing wayfinding signs there. There will be routes and places that you will recognize. So out of McMinnville, Carlton, and Yamhill.
And thank you. I realize that it's now 9 o'clock, but I really appreciate you all listening. If you have questions now, I'm happy to take them. It's just that your mayor is my timekeeper.
Just a quick question.
Councilor Roldmullen.
Can you provide a copy of this presentation to Shannon so she can give it to us?
I believe that she has it, and yes. And then on the so part of our work too, this is a very like skipping over lots of details. We do have a 56-page report on the planning up to now and then to the next few months and years ahead that we'll make available on our website too, for those who really want to dig in and find the details of like what kinds of trails these are and why they're designed the way they are.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Just a quick
Yes.
statement. Thank you so very much for working at bringing more recreational opportunities to Yamhill, Oregon, because previously I lived in Hood River, Oregon. That place had an abundance of recreation from the mountain down to the river. And there was even a mountain bike place that was not too far from Hood River that's very, very enjoyable. So thank you for what you're doing.
Oh, it's so good to hear. And I will say that Post Canyon is amazing. Our kids, it's their favorite place to mountain bike in any place we've ever mountain biked. And we have at Yamhill County Public Works, Hood River County or Hood River, City of Hood River's Public Works Director and their parks manager. So I feel like we're doing well with like having real competent folks who really understand parks and the value of them. So thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Casey and Phil, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you
Absolutely.
all.
And you know, if anybody needs to get a hold of either of us, you know, you can either reach out through the Cycle Yamhill County website. Obviously, I think you've got Casey's contact information. You
We can find him.
Yeah, and you can pretty easily find my wife, Katrina, and I. We own a local business here, Pacific Crest Real Estate Advisors. So we're around. You've seen our signs. We're easy to find.
Thank you all
Thank
so
you
much.
both.
Thanks for all you
Thank you.
do, including those hard decisions about parks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Maybe our new slogan could be the Hood River.
No. Thanks, Morgan. All righty. Ordinance, item D, ordinance 2024-747, second reading.
Yes, the ordinance that was in front of you last month, council. This is about the updates to the public contracting that was passed by the legislature. This is for your review and consideration for a second reading and passage.
Yeah. Do
I move that the city council authorize the second reading of ordinance 2024-747, an ordinance amending chapter 3.04 of the Carlton Municipal Code relating to public contracting by title only.
It's been moved and seconded.
Voice vote.
Voice vote. Can we go here, folks?
Aye.
Aye.
Did you say voice vote? I'm sorry.
Yeah. It's just waiting
Yes,
for.
not roll
Aye.
call.
Oh, okay. Aye.
Thank you. I'm glad I don't have to read this all. Ordinance 2024-747, an ordinance amending chapter 3.04 of the Carlton Municipal Code relating to public contracting.
Make a motion that the city council accept the second reading of ordinance 2024-747, an ordinance amending chapter 3.04 of the Carlton Municipal Code relating to public contracting.
All in favor?
This is a roll call.
Oh. You always do this to me. Okay,
I don't do it. It's the rules.
all righty.
Alright. Counselor David Samuel Hill, how do you vote?
Aye.
Counselor Carolyn Thompson Riser, how do you vote?
Aye.
Counselor Grant Erickson, how do you vote?
Aye.
Counselor Guillermo Brandao, how do you vote?
Aye.
Counselor Shirley Ward Mullen, how do you vote?
Aye.
Council President Kevin Skipper, how do you vote?
Aye.
Mayor Linda Watkins, how do you vote?
Aye.
Passes.
Is that the last vote we need?
For this ordinance, yes.
Thank
It
you.
will go into effect 30 days after today.
All righty.
I
Thank
think
you.
it's actually 30 days after you sign it, Mayor, and you get to sign it within like 2 days or so. About 30 days.
They'll be on. All righty. We are moving along to item E 2024-25, the council goals approval.
Yes, Mayor and Council, I know this was a long time ago, but on January 20th, you came together to discuss your goals for the upcoming year. And those small minor changes are in front of you this evening for your formal acceptance.
Is there any discussion or comments on that? I wasn't moving ahead fast enough here. Comments, concerns? Or have has anybody gotten there yet? Do we have a recommendation?
I move that city council adopt the 24-25 council goals.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carried. Down to item G, resolution 2024-352.
Actually, we're gonna go to item F.
Did I manage to miss that one?
Ordinance 2024-748, and you won't want to miss this one. This is actually limited
Yeah.
liability protection.
I apologize, Shannon. I thought I had it, but just moving right along. All righty, go for it.
Well, as Margaret very kindly gave me some credit for, I don't deserve all the credit. But this, there is a statute that allows for local jurisdictions to limit their liability for trails and paths that are in public easements or public rights of way. That statute, however, does not automatically apply to every local jurisdiction in Oregon for municipalities, or it's actually local jurisdictions. For local jurisdictions with fewer than 500,000 residents, we have to affirmatively opt in for the liability protection contained. The statute is ORS 105.668. So this is not quite as expansive as the recreational immunity, but it is, in my view and CIS's view, a very prudent step to take to add this to our municipal code so that we are afforded the liability protections offered by ORS 105.668, which would apply to trails and paths. And
Go ahead, sorry.
I am also proposing that we, as long as the ordinance passes unanimously on the first reading, I would recommend that we pass, that we hold both of our readings tonight so that we can get this into effect as quickly as possible.
My question is why, can you explain why it has to be in code? Why are we not already protected under ORS 105.668?
The statute specifically requires us to opt in. We don't have to actually include the language in our code. That is a recommended way to adopt the liability limitation, which I agree with. My concern, if we just pass a resolution that says we're opting into this, is resolutions kind of slip away after time. And this way it's codified. The ordinance includes the relevant language from the statute so that the statutory language is codified in our code and we have sort of as beefed up a protection as we can at this point.
And that's essentially all it is. It's not increasing insurance or anything like that on CISN. It's just,
The ordinance?
yeah,
No, the ordinance won't increase the insurance. The changes in the law will have an impact on the insurance.
but right now we're just putting
And
this
any
into,
claims that come our way will increase insurance.
But this should help to keep those, to
Right.
keep the claims, yeah,
Keep 'em down.
down and expense.
And this was recommended by CIS.
Yes, it was.
Okay. Any more discussion?
What? Move forward with the motion.
Do we have a motion?
Have a motion. Oh.
Go
you
for
do
it.
Okay. I move we authorize the reading of ordinance 2024-748, an ordinance establishing chapter 12.13 of the Carlton Municipal Code, limiting liability for use of certain recreational property and declaring an emergency by title only.
Second.
Okay. Where do we go from here?
Voice vote.
Okay, is there a vote?
Aye.
Okay,
Ordinance, oh, I lost my number. Ordinance 2024-748, an ordinance establishing chapter 12.13 of the Carlton Municipal Code, limiting liability for use of certain recreational property and declaring an emergency.
It is moved that the city council accept the first reading of ordinance 2024-748, an ordinance establishing establishing chapter 12.3 of the Carlton Municipal Code, limiting liability for use of certain recreational property and declaring an emergency.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded.
Roll call, please, Morgan.
Right. Counselor David Samuel Hill, how do you vote?
Aye.
Counselor Carolyn Thompson Riser, how do you vote?
Aye.
Counselor Grant Erickson, how do you vote?
Aye.
Counselor Guillermo Brandao, how do you vote?
Aye.
Counselor Shirley Ward Mullen, how do you vote?
Aye.
Council President Kevin Skipper, how do you vote?
Aye.
Mayor Linda Watkins, how do you?
Aye.
Motion passes.
So because we passed that unanimously on the first reading, we can hold our second reading. So what we would need is a motion.
We need a motion to,
I move that the city council authorize the second reading of ordinance 2024 748, an ordinance establishing chapter 12.13 of the Carlton Municipal Code, limiting liability for use of certain recreational property and declaring an emergency by title only.
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Ordinance 2024-748, an ordinance establishing 12.13, chapter 12.13 of the Carlton Municipal Code, limiting liability for use of certain recreational property and declaring an emergency.
It is moved that the city council accept the second reading of ordinance 2024-748. An ordinance establishing chapter 12.13 of the Carlton Municipal Code, limiting liability for use of certain recreational property and declaring an emergency.
Do we need a voice vote?
Second.
Okay, we need a second.
Roll call vote, please, Morgan.
Counselor David Samuel Hill, how do you vote?
Aye.
Counselor Carolyn Thompson Riser, how do you vote?
Aye.
Counselor Grant Erickson, how do you vote?
Aye.
Counselor Guillermo Brandao, how do you vote?
Aye.
Counselor Shirley Ward Mullen, how do you vote?
Aye.
Council President Kevin Skipper, how do you vote?
Aye.
Mayor Linda Watkins, how do you vote?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay. We done?
With that item, yes.
Yes. Things. Okay, now moving on to resolution 2024-352.
Yes, this is resolution 2024-352. This is regarding the check signers for our accounts with the change in the council presidency. And since she's hung with us, I'm gonna ask Christy Martinez to jump in here.
I did hang in. I was working on budget though, so if you, I wasn't slacking. So what this resolution does is for Council President Kevin Skipper to be added as a authorized signer. The bank requires minutes from the council approving that. He'll have to fill out some paperwork, but the city, for audit standards, wants to make sure that we have independent people looking at all the invoices, which would be the mayor and council president Skipper. We're gonna leave Shirley as a backup at this point for if someone's not available. Shannon and I typically don't like to sign checks as we're more heavily involved in this, but this is a housekeeping item that the bank requires.
Is there any discussion questions? Okay.
Perfectly clear.
It is moved that the city council approve and authorize the mayor to sign resolution number 2024-352, designating specific individuals to transact business with First Federal Savings and Loan.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you, Mayor and Council.
Thank you. All right, we are down to item H, participation policy.
Yes, thank you, Mayor and Council. In front of you is a electronic meeting participation policy. This is in relation to what we've been talking about regarding Zoom bombing. You may have seen this in the news, you may have seen it at other city council meetings. This has come out of that. This is a combination of several cities have put together these participation regulations to provide a clear path of how you participate civilly at meetings. This has been reviewed by your city attorney. In addition to this participation policy, we're asking for consideration of moving citizen comment to the end of the agenda from where it is currently at. The purpose of that is twofold. Part of it is that for citizens joining our meetings, lasting till the end, that they would obtain a lot of information through the discussions that are had here, the hard decisions that are had here. The other part of that is that should we experience an unfortunate issue, if we have to take action, then the rest of our meeting agenda is not. Do you want to give more information on that to the attorney?
No, I think it is a good way to address that concern without derailing our.
I do think I agree with what you're saying about avoiding those Zoom bombings and, you know, encouraging citizen involvement. Also, as you can see by the clock tonight, it kind of does create first, you know what I mean? I kind of have this also respecting the community's time of, you know, our meetings start at 6. We're not even to citizen comments at this point in time, you know what I mean? At 9:30, that feels like that could become a point of contention, especially as we open up the new civic center and hopefully there's more involvement back in person like there was in the past. So I see the benefit of it, but I would be I wanted to get that said on the record that while I feel like it's a good idea now, I feel like maybe in the future it might need revisited.
Or should we just wait till we have our first event? You know, I mean, do we really need to do this right now? Can we, when we open the new city hall and have an in-person meeting, it's gonna be new for Carlton. For 4 or 5 years, we haven't done anything like that. And are people going to be respectful and polite, and do we need to make them all stay there for 3 or 4 hours?
Well, hopefully with the new facility, we'll have more interest in actually attending the meetings. Historically, though, prior to COVID and the other facility, I mean, unless there was something really hot on the agenda, you'd be lucky if you had one person
Yeah,
showing
so
up.
you probably aren't gonna have too many brood ones. And also, we did have a workshop, so we were only an hour.
But are you more concerned about somebody coming in over Zoom, not like in person?
That has been the experience thus far with cities. That's increasing in frequency, is that the person is coming via Zoom.
And it's not even necessarily always that person. The city of Beaverton was kind of, as far as I know, the only city so far that's had an issue to the level that they had it, but it seemed like it was some type of chat bot program, something that was automatically generating the speech, not a number of people waiting to talk. And you could,
Somebody that wanted to engage in that, could they try to pull that off at the beginning, whether we were having some comments or not?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
I am not a tech person. I mean, like
Just unmute themselves and start talking.
And I don't know how the settings are about people being able to unmute themselves or whether we can force mute them.
Morgan has more advanced knowledge of Zoom's capabilities, but we've taken actions to be able to put people in waiting rooms, put them back into waiting rooms so that they can't engage.
And this Zoom will continue even in the new building, right?
It's a
It's
state
law
mandate.
Forever.
It is a state mandate that you have to allow for a virtual participation option, whether that's Zoom or some other software. Morgan, do you have more specifics that
I know that we do have the ability to force mute and unmute people. I know that one of the reasons that we don't currently is so when counselors are attending via Zoom, they're able to mute and unmute themselves as needed for doing voting and such. That's kind of the only drawback to muting everybody in a blanket setting. But we also, as it stands right now, we don't allow the chat feature in Zoom. So that is something that can be blocked so that people can't get in and just start typing whatever they feel. One thing that we were experiencing in the past is that people will change their participant name to something, rude or slanderous. And that's something where, a policy might be beneficial to remove that ability from people, or give us the ability to remove them if they have something that's not appropriate. But there's a lot of really beneficial settings that Zoom has, so we can tinker with stuff as we need to.
one other thing, your participation policy also gives several ways to interact and what you will be seeing, and it is not uncommon even prior to this, is people will have to sign up to speak, whether they sign up virtually or in person, and they will have to be called on. Councilor Hill.
I think having policies in place is imperative. I have seen the devastating effects that poorly managed meetings and poorly behaved individuals can have on meetings. I also would like to encourage us to exercise caution at putting the public comments to the end, because I don't want people to feel like they're getting shut down or shut out. That's just my take on it. And that's all I've got. Thank you.
The only thing I was gonna add to that is that perhaps as a compromise, I'm not quite sure how this would be facilitated, that if someone who was interested in attending to add something to citizen comments, that if they know, it's gonna be at the end and they cannot wait till 9:30 to participate, that we would make an exception in advance.
And there is also in your policy that if they put their comment in as an email or something, that the mayor reads that.
So you could do it in the beginning.
And that's part of your policy, that when citizen comment comes, let's say I can't stay to the end of the meeting, I submit my comment and the mayor reads that. Shannon Beaucaire states that X, Y, and Z about public trails.
One thing I was gonna add is just, not that it's happened maybe once or twice in my 3 years of council, but the opportunity to speak to items on the agenda for the public is important. Because we've already passed resolutions, we've already done it. And so somebody has something important to say about an item that we're gonna be voting on, and we've already voted on it, then they get to say it at the end and say, well, sorry, we've already made our decision. So that's part of my fear too. And so I don't know if grouping it to items on the agenda at the front, and then does that protect us from Zoom bombs? Maybe if you want to speak to something I don't know. I mean, we know the reality of it. For the last 3 years, there's hardly any comments. So maybe it's a non-issue, but that's another fear. That's another thing to think about, is we pass resolutions and ordinances of items that are on the agenda. And if maybe they'll submit them in writing and we can see it beforehand. But as a policy making body, we've already voted on something. And if somebody doesn't have the opportunity to talk about it till the end, How would that feel?
There's also another aspect to this is being elected, and with the way the Constitution reads, especially the First Amendment, for people to have the right to redress grievances with the government. That's very important. We do not want to deny rights at any point in time, in my opinion, unless somebody shows that their behavior is so poor that they cannot be afforded it.
Okay. So where are we, folks?
I like the participation policy, I do. I just struggle on the citizen comment portion.
And it
I
is
see the
two
benefit
separate
of it.
issues. They are not necessarily one.
So, I read it, but I've already kind of forgotten it through the night. So if somebody jumps onto Zoom, say tonight, unless they've priorly submitted information, we can't call on them.
The idea is to provide that order so that people are signing up, so we know who it is and not necessarily out.
Can that be done by saying, like it says, to state your name, your address? Like a bot, would a bot be able to do that, I guess, and make up some address in Carlton? I don't know. Like, is that a way we find out, besides saying you have to submit this and then people coming on going, well, we gotta fill out this paperwork before we can call on you, sorry. I don't.
Address Carlton. Is it?
I don't think it has to be in Carlton. I think.
But is it anybody outside of city limits? Well, right.
I think people could write programs to do essentially anything and everything. But it's just one more little roadblock or hurdle that we can put up so that it's not so easy for someone to inundate us. The public comment forms can also provide a way for sort of an organized way for citizens to provide their written comments. I know in one of my other cities, we added a Google form or something to the website so that people need to sign up to provide public comment. But then there's also the spot where they can just type their comment in, and then it just comes through as an email. So if somebody works evenings and can't come in or something.
I like that.
What do you want to do?
So maybe I'm missing it, but I don't feel like I saw that wording of, so it says in providing comments on page 167, speakers who attend in person will be called upon the mayor in the order they are signed up. Oh, it does say in order they are signed up. So somewhere I'm missing that sign up portion.
There is a form that's referenced in the document.
I mean, I'd be comfortable with the form. I just want to be able to have some leeway to not shut somebody out because they didn't fill out a form.
So, and I think the city attorney elaborate on this, is there's room for flexibility, but once you offer flexibility, you have to offer it for all people. And so that's why the procedure, the participation the policy that we're trying to. It's not to chill people from being able to state their grievances or their thoughts. This is unfortunately a result of some unfortunate bad actors who have happened in other cities that we're seeing more and more come up, that they're not going away. It wasn't just a fun event. They're actually targeting other cities, small cities.
When this happens, what's the point in time where she just pushes the button with her? Muted.
Probably when I tell her to. And I don't know, had the sheriff called to a other meeting that I was at, so I don't mind defending you guys from people who are being disruptive.
And as we've talked about before, there's time, place, and manner restrictions that can be put on there, but there's also the First Amendment. And so therefore, looking at policies like this is one of those things that comes with prevention with a common cure. So after it happens, or while it's happening, it can be a little more challenging than trying to prevent it from happening in the first place.
So can we just put some kind, or would Linda read the part about this public, more wording in there about, you know, being decent on it, no name calling, all of that kind of. That's for the attorney to.
We have those rules already.
Right, so does that need to be said each time, each meeting, so it's out there, and then if it happens, you get to pull the plug?
Well, we can essentially always kick out somebody who's being disruptive, whether or not we had any type of policy. Having council rules that govern everybody's behavior allows us to be a little bit more.
Well, that was what I'm saying, is it would still leave it at the beginning of the meeting, because I agree with Kevin that if we vote on something, somebody has something to say, they might as well just hang up. So I still think it should be at the front of the meeting when things are being decided upon, have something that states that if you get this way,
And
this is what's gonna happen.
Amy had that, like the splash screen in the waiting room. Oh my God. Somebody talked about telegraphs or something. But Amy,
Oh, yes, in the waiting room, there is a policy. So if you sign in and you get put into the waiting room, it tells you, you know, when you are allowed to speak, these are the rules in which you're supposed to speak by. But participation policy also gives us something to refer back to as a policy that was put in place. So when somebody says, well, why are you asking me to do that? Why are you asking me to be decent? Because we passed this policy about how you'll civilly act when providing commentary. And this is when it was discussed. It wasn't, Counselor Erickson just decided that what you said wasn't decent, so we cut you off. It was a policy that was discussed in great length.
You need to have the policy, but I believe that we need to have, I feel that it's important to have public comment towards the beginning of the meeting for exactly what President Skipper brought up.
Well, and to add to that, just thinking about it, there's been several times when, you know, someone in the community has wanted to address, and they get during public comments, and I go, you know, come to the, that was before when you could come or dial it on Zoom. It's at the beginning of the meeting, so they know a certain time they have to be there, and then they do their business and it's over.
Rather than sitting there until 9
Well,
o'clock.
they're
at
not
night
gonna
or
do
whatever,
that.
yeah.
They're just not gonna do that. Well, I mean, it
or
would
they'll
have to
do
be
it.
very
and
important to
They'll
them.
get very, very grumpy for 3.5 hours.
So, I mean, there's gotta be something to put in for policy, but still be able to have.
Well, there are two different issues.
Yeah.
They are two different issues in your memo. They're two different motions.
I'm okay with the policy again and I understand that we might be opening it up to other people, but I feel like that's in the council rules that the mayor has the ability to call upon people when she deems worthy. And so I feel like if somebody popped in and didn't have, we looked at Morgan and said, did they sign up? You know, and she said no, we say, if you want, you would say, please state your name and address and we'll allow you 3 minutes. I mean, because yeah, like you said, people, we're all busy, you know what I mean? So you're not gonna remember to go back to the policy to go, oh, I need to email Mrs. Amerson. You know what I mean, that I wanna get on Zoom tonight at 7 because I just got home at 6:45, you know what I mean? So it's just trying to not, I mean, part of our thing is public engagement and encouraging citizen involvement, and so I don't wanna do anything that dissuades that. And not that, I don't think it's a good thing to kind of have something in place for the reasons we're talking about, but feel like not having the opportunity to call on somebody because they didn't sign up. I mean, it's gonna be a lot easier in person because you show up, you sign the attendance sheet. That's gonna be easy. You know, it's more for the technology.
Another thing is, I wouldn't say it necessarily would guarantee somebody the ability to speak because I've seen overwhelming amounts of people sign up to make comments before. I think people who sign up to make comments would be helpful, especially in a high traffic meeting. If you know how many people are coming to speak to us, that would be a great help. So, I would encourage people to sign up to speak, but I don't know about making it mandatory.
Well, it would.
It just,
Oh, go ahead.
may I jump in? Sorry. There aren't any time limits about signing up before you speak. So to use your example, Kevin, you get home at 6:45, you've been busy, you really want to talk, you could at 7 sign in. You don't, there's no.
Well, but here it says that you have to email Amy Emerson if you're gonna do it virtually.
To provide an email comment. To email it, provide you.
And during the meeting, it says contact by phone or by email. It does say by 12 p.m. that day. And there can be policy and you don't have to be rigid. You can highly encourage because for the reasons you know who's coming, you know how much time to allot for citizen comment.
Yeah. And that's what all I'm saying. As long as there's flexibility in it, I'm okay with policy.
Just
As
as long
long-
as there's not enough flexibility that there is no policy.
Well, can we just remove the part about the virtually? Or change it? I mean, that's what I see as the biggest issue that's
All
gonna
that
happen.
12 p.m. deadline is saying is that's how you reach out to Amy to get a link to attend the meeting.
That's kind of, yeah. So maybe it's
And
a
those
mute
are
point,
on the agenda.
then I'm good then.
And I think we could also delete the by 12 p.m.
It does allow for increased planning if people do it. We always take as in, we had a presentation at 5:23 p.m. this evening. We adjusted and we adapted and we overcame. But if in general, people know it's 12 p.m., that helps out quite a bit because that gets the majority.
I'm okay with moving forward with the participation policy, but
That sounds like a motion.
I haven't moved it yet. I was gonna let everybody to say that. They're good. Are you good?
Good.
Good, Grant?
Yep.
Hear me? All right, I move that the city council approve the 2024 participation policy and procedures.
Second.
Second, third. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries.
3 quick things.
You do?
Remember at the end of the meeting, I added them to the agenda
Yes. Why did you do that? Go.
because it involves money.
All right, listen.
In front of you, you have one letter that says to whom it may concern. About a week after we started pouring concrete, after talking about modifying the sidewalk program, I got reached out by the workforce program and they have a contractor in Salem that is interested and they want to go out for a grant to try to find funding. So.
Plan.
It never fails.
Time out, otherwise I'm not gonna get through this quickly. They've asked for a letter of support. I told them we would proceed with caution and very slowly, and because we had already modified the program that we taken into account. I do not see any downside and having the mayor write a letter of support for the grant process and just see where we go. It's hard to get funding right now. It's hard to get sidewalk funding.
Yeah.
So I would like for council to consider authorizing the mayor to modify this letter to support this grant, and we see where we go.
All they can do is say no, right?
All you can do is say no. And even if the grant says yes, there may be something else that comes up, not like anything's come up in 3 years of trying to do this.
Well, you gotta start sometime.
I'd like to make a motion to authorize the mayor to edit and send the letter of support to Willamette Workforce Partnerships for this strategic innovation grant proposal.
Okay. I think you should say direct instead of authorize.
I direct.
Okay.
That doesn't
Whatever.
feel right.
Okay, all in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. All right.
Second item. That second letter in front of you, this is related to Representative Elmer's workforce housing bill. This is the bill that she's putting forward to push forward for cities to obtain infrastructure monies for properties that are very difficult and costly to put infrastructure on, that are then impeding the growth of affordable housing. We had a property owner in town that was interested in putting affordable housing on a piece of property that is very difficult to put infrastructure on. It's one of the reasons this property has not transitioned over time, because it is very costly to put infrastructure on. So we asked to be a part of this bill. She included us as part of this bill. She has asked for letters of support. And so with that, I asked the mayor to draft this letter of support so that we can put it as testimony. So in part, I'm asking for the council to, whether or not you are okay with this submission of this letter of support.
Yeah. In addition, wouldn't it be helpful if we all separately did this and put it on the?
Certainly.
Because I've done that on the legislative, I forget what it's called,
Yeah.
going online.
You can submit testimony. And this would be considered testimony.
And I would have to submit my letter, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would recommend that everybody submit their own personal letter. This is just coming from me. So the more traffic you get across the legislator's desk in support of something, the more they are apt to actually support it. And I've seen this in action up at the Capitol.
Could get an electronic copy of this letter so that it can be, like, I can modify it to
What I can do is I can send you Representative Elmer's, her staff has sent bullet points that they want. And so that you can take the bullet points that they would like to see incorporated in all letters of support and customize them to your own style and your own talking. And while you're doing that, the other thing I'd like you to support is Representative Elmer. In the short session, it was requested that cities not ask for funding requests. When she reached out, when our force main ruptured, I followed up and said, you said, how can I help? This is how you can help. Our fear of our sanitary lines starting to rupture and collapse is now here. And so she allowed for us to submit an $11.5 million sanitary funding request in the short session, even though they were not encouraging cities to do so. I will get the information, but I would encourage every single one of you, of when we get that bill number, that you write your legislatures, encourage support, talk to your constituents, have them submit to their legislature. That is huge. 11.5 million, and to do it on the time in a short session in which they were not looking for funding requests. That's significant. And when I said, should I cut back and make a smaller request? She said, no, submit the whole thing. So, well, I'll get that information to you, but I would ask you to talk to your neighbors, have everybody submit requests for that funding. And then last but
Can I just jump in and say that Representative Elmer has really incredibly hit the ground running, fighting for all of the small cities here and absolutely back Shannon up on backing Representative Elmer up. She's
She's
getting money
been-
into this county
yeah.
like I would never expect from a freshman.
And as the counselor pointed out, the more people she hears from, the more people that are heard in legislature, the more likely it is that that will be passed.
So you're gonna give us talking points to submit that to her.
I can.
I thought you just said you were going to do that. No, you said
No.
it about this, but then you said something about.
Once she has the bill number.
Yeah, so this letter is to a different bill.
Exactly, I know that.
That will come with talking points
The Elmer regarding the.
From
for the
Elmer.
testimony, yes,
Yeah.
for the bill.
Having those
Wait,
talking
wait.
points helps. too,
And
because-
Shirley is
Shirley wants
asking about
clarification on the sewer, yeah.
Second,
Don't have talking points for that. I
No, I
will
thought
have
you
to
said-
create them.
oh no, I thought you said that's something you were gonna give us.
Yes, for the previous bill.
Oh,
Are we waiting on a bill number for the other one that you said? Or we just,
Yes. So for the
so
11,
you'll send us the bill number?
for 11.5 million, I will send you the bill number. I do not have that yet. For House Bill 4134, that is in front of you right now for a letter of support, I will send you the talking points. That for staff.
So, city manager, do you want to see our letters of support before we send them in to make sure that they are well within reason? Or do you trust us?
Those are not your only two options, Shannon. You don't have to trust them, but we don't have to micro.
How about I draft some talking points for that once I get the bill number?
I mean, it would be
Wonderful, thank
helpful,
you.
just a few points so that I, send her a competent,
Okay, I will work on drafting those. Last but not least, I wanted to update you on my all-day meeting with ODOT on January 29th. The most productive item I got out of there was discussions about their delivery of the West Main project. And what we are going to focus on for this calendar year of 2024 is the intergovernmental agreement between ODOT and the city of Carlton for ODOT to deliver the project. As well as there is some internal shuffling. If you remember, we had a small city allotment grant of $100,000. They're not going to call it a small city allotment grant. It's going to be called something different internally, but there's shuffling. I need to make sure we don't lose it. So I want to take the year to very carefully iron out that agreement to make sure it's thorough, because when it's rushed, sometimes things get left out. Also through that, they are in agreement, they also do not have capacity to deliver the West Main project internally. So they will be hiring a consultant to deliver the project. Through that, we are going to see what we can do to have Gordon's firm Tetra Tech as the consultant or as a sub-consultant to their pre-approved list to see what we can do for somebody who knows our road system, who's been familiar with the project, who would also save money. So we're going to focus on that in 2024. 2025 would be going out to bid. We have to obligate the funds, actually have them under contract by 2026 and the project completed by 2030. Those are normally deadlines I would never look at because I always deal in 1 year and 18-month increments trying to get things completed. However, what that also allows us to do, even though we're kind of slowing down the contracting process for West Main, is it allows us to get through the EPA process because we're still waiting on some waivers and other paperwork to get our $2.2 million. That is for Grant Street Sanitary, as well as a portion of Main Street. And the portion of whatever's left over, I've told our team to prioritize the sanitary under West Main, so we're not paving it to cut it up and do the sanitary at a later point. So that's the plan of action on that one. OR 47 is a little more amorphous. I've asked them to look at doing a corridor study in conjunction with our TSP, since OR 47 will not be the primary focus of our TSP update. They're going to look into that. They are also talking to Marion County, who was one of the agencies I reached out to do the West Main delivery. And they were at capacity, but our area manager has been in contact with them about potentially looking at the smaller roundabouts that Marion County is implementing and encouraging. We did talk about truck restrictions. I didn't get very far with those, so conversations we're still working on. But I wanted to give you a generalized update of the meeting, and that is really small tidbits of the whole day. It really was 8 hours in Salem. That is my updates. I'm done.
Any questions? Yeah. Did you have a question or were you just, okay. All righty. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second? All in favor? Thank you for the update, Shannon.
Thanks for hanging with me for the last 3 days.